The sound of laughter echoed through the crowd, but Keanu Reeves could hardly hear it over the pounding of his heart. It was supposed to be just another public interview. Nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, standing on stage in front of hundreds of eyes, he could feel the weight of Charlie Dawson's words hanging in the air like an accusation. Keanu Reeves, Charlie began, leaning into the microphone, his sharp tone cutting through the calm atmosphere. You know, it's surprising to me that someone so quiet, so elusive, can have such a fan base. Do you even have an opinion on anything, or is your entire career just an escape from real life? The crowd's response was mixed. Some people chuckled, perhaps at Charlie's sarcastic delivery, while others looked to Keanu, waiting for a response. Keanu remained still, his expression unreadable. He had faced far worse in his career. Tabloid rumors, false accusations, endless gossip, but this felt different. This wasn't a paparazzi jab or an anonymous tweet. This was direct, personal, and it hurt. Charlie continued, sensing the opportunity to push further. I mean, sure, you're the quiet guy with all the heartwarming charity stories, but when was the last time you stood for something that mattered in a real, tangible way? Is it all just a facade? Keanu's lips parted slightly, a brief moment where he considered responding. The eyes of the audience were locked on him, waiting, hungry for any kind of drama. He knew the script. He could take the high road, offer a vague, polite answer about love and humanity, and leave it at that. Or he could finally say what was on his mind. But instead, he did something no one expected. He smiled. Not the guarded, polite smile that was a trademark of his celebrity, but a smile that seemed to say, I understand. Without a word, he took a deep breath, standing silently in the spotlight. His silence was louder than any retort could ever be. It was as if the weight of every unspoken word, every moment of his life, rested in that silence. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Charlie's voice broke through the tense moment. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The audience was left in suspense. No one knew how to respond. The journalists backstage were already drafting headlines, speculating on what might happen next. Would Keanu speak up? Would he challenge Charlie? Or would he simply walk off? Keanu didn't walk off. He stayed. He allowed the moment to pass, letting the silence linger long enough to let the weight of the exchange settle. But something inside him shifted. Why did it always have to be like this? Why was he always the subject of mockery for simply being himself? As the interview continued, Keanu's mind wandered. This moment, the jab in front of so many, was not just about Charlie's words. It was a reminder of the constant scrutiny he faced in the public eye. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He had always chosen not to react, choosing peace over confrontation. But now, standing here in front of Charlie, he wasn't so sure anymore. What would it take for the world to see him for who he really was? Keanu Reeves wasn't always the calm, composed figure the world knew. Before the fame, before the roles that made him a household name, he was a young boy trying to navigate a chaotic world. He didn't come from wealth or privilege. His story, like many others, was one of resilience. A story marked by early hardship, unexpected twists, and an inner strength that few could see on the surface. Keanu was born in Beirut, Lebanon, to an English mother and an American father, but his early years were anything but stable. His father left when he was just a child, leaving Keanu to grow up with his mother, Patricia, in Toronto. His childhood wasn't one of lavish comforts. In fact, the family struggled financially, often moving from place to place as Keanu's mother tried to make ends meet. His relationship with his father, who had never been a constant figure in his life, was strained. But it was his mother, with her own set of challenges, who taught Keanu the importance of kindness, humility, and perseverance. She worked tirelessly to support him, and despite the hardship, Keanu grew up surrounded by love. His mother's dedication and sacrifices would forever shape his character. As a teenager, Keanu found solace in the arts, particularly in acting. He was a sensitive, introverted child, and the stage offered him a way to escape his personal struggles. But he wasn't immediately successful. He faced rejection after rejection, the sting of casting calls where his name was never called, a feeling he never quite got used to. Yet, Keanu didn't give up. He took odd jobs to support himself while continuing to hone his craft. It was during these early years that Keanu met some of the people who would become lifelong friends, people who would help him rise when his dreams seemed too distant to reach. Sandra Bullock, who would later become one of his closest confidants, was one of the first people to see past the quiet demeanor and recognize his true talent. Their bond would grow through years of shared experiences in Hollywood, an unspoken understanding between two actors who knew the price of fame. But it wasn't just his professional journey that shaped Keanu. He also faced devastating personal losses that left scars, though he rarely talked about them. His younger sister, Kim, battled leukemia for several years, a fight that weighed heavily on the family. Keanu was there for her every step of the way, supporting her through chemotherapy and treatments, but despite their efforts, Kim passed away when Keanu was in his late 20s. Losing Kim left a profound mark on him. It altered his perception of life, fame, and the fleeting nature of everything. Keanu became a man who avoided the spotlight as much as possible, preferring to spend his time quietly, often giving away large portions of his earnings to charity, and living a modest life despite his fame. His personal tragedies taught him that love and kindness were the only true constants in life. This was the Keanu Reeves that the public didn't know. This was the man behind the stoic figure on screen. While the world saw a star, Keanu was still that boy from Toronto who had learned to face adversity with grace, never asking for anything in return, and quietly moving through the world as if he didn't need the applause. It was this quiet strength, this ability to endure personal loss and continue forward with a heart full of empathy, that made the mockery from Charlie Dawson sting even more. Keanu wasn't some detached celebrity. He had fought through pain, loss, and rejection. He knew the value of peace and the price of a kind heart in a world that often seemed to reward anything but that. As Keanu sat backstage after the interview, his mind was racing, not with anger, but with questions. Why had Charlie gone out of his way to attack him publicly? What had he done to deserve such mockery? The calm that had enveloped him in the moment of silence was beginning to shift into a quiet resolve. He didn't have to answer in anger, but he wasn't going to let this moment pass without addressing it. It was time to show the world who he truly was, not through the lens of tabloids or social media, but through his own words, his truth. And so, Keanu decided to speak. Charlie Dawson had built his career on controversy. He was a journalist who thrived on stirring the pot, constantly challenging the norms and pushing boundaries. His brand of bold, often brash commentary had earned him a loyal following, but it also made him the target of many critics. In the world of media, where outrage often trumps accuracy, Charlie had carved out a niche for himself as the bad boy of liberal journalism. But it hadn't always been this way. Charlie wasn't born with the sharp edge that he wielded so freely now. Growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey, he was the son of well-meaning, middle-class parents who, despite their best efforts, couldn't provide the kind of life Charlie thought he deserved. His father worked as an accountant, and his mother was a schoolteacher. They had instilled in him a strong work ethic and the idea that success was a result of personal merit. But Charlie always felt like an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit in with the polished, perfect images of success he saw in the media. From a young age, Charlie had been a restless soul. He wasn't the star athlete or the golden child in school. Instead, he was the one who questioned authority, who challenged teachers and authority figures, constantly probing for cracks in the system. He was the kid who read books on politics and social justice while others were out playing sports or making friends. His passion for making a difference, for calling out injustice, led him to journalism. But like many idealistic young people, Charlie's early days in the field didn't exactly go as planned. His early years as a reporter were marked by rejection, unflattering assignments, and long hours of writing articles that no one would read. He was often overlooked, his opinions dismissed as naive and too radical for the mainstream audience. It wasn't until he found his voice in the world of op-eds that things began to change. Charlie realized that the key to success wasn't just in reporting the news, it was in shaping the narrative. He could become the voice that people loved to hate, the one who challenged celebrities and social elites, pointing out their flaws and calling them out for their hypocrisy. It was a dangerous game, but it paid off. Slowly, his controversial articles started to gain traction. People either loved him for his unfiltered truth or despised him for his unrelenting criticism. But he didn't care. He thrived in the chaos. In the years that followed, Charlie became known for his unapologetic, sometimes cruel takes on Hollywood. He didn't care about the celebrities' feelings, believing they had too much power and influence to be treated with kid gloves. In his mind, people like Keanu Reeves, quiet, humble, and seemingly perfect, were just the kind of people who needed to be taken down a peg. His articles painted them as out of touch, self-righteous, or worse, phony. Keanu, of course, had never been on Charlie's radar. The actor had always maintained a low profile, staying out of the gossip columns and keeping his personal life private. But that made him an even more tempting target for Charlie. People like Keanu, who were adored for their humility, made for great fodder when Charlie wanted to provoke a response. So when the opportunity arose for him to mock Keanu in a public interview, he took it without hesitation. Charlie's words in the interview weren't just about Keanu. They were a calculated attack, a way to stir up the public and generate headlines. He knew that Keanu's calm demeanor and quiet nature would make him an easy target, someone who wouldn't retaliate. And that, to Charlie, made Keanu the perfect subject for his latest column. But as the event unfolded, Charlie began to feel an unexpected shift. Keanu's response, the silence, the calm, wasn't what he had expected. The audience was uncomfortable, and Charlie was beginning to sense that the narrative was slipping away from him. This wasn't the drama-filled spectacle he had envisioned. Instead, Keanu had turned the tables, making Charlie's attack seem petty and childish in comparison. Still, Charlie refused to back down. He couldn't afford to show weakness. His career, his reputation, had been built on confronting the establishment, on being the voice that dared to question everything. To admit defeat would mean losing his edge, losing the very thing that had made him popular in the first place. So Charlie doubled down. He wrote a scathing follow-up column, mocking Keanu's silence and calling it a sign of weakness. He accused Keanu of being out of touch with the real world, a privileged celebrity who hid behind his public persona of humility instead of actually standing up for anything meaningful. The article went viral, with people on both sides of the debate weighing in. Some sided with Charlie, applauding his courage to call out a fake celebrity, while others defended Keanu, praising his restraint and character. But as the days passed, Charlie began to realize that the public reaction wasn't as simple as he'd hoped. His critics were growing louder, and Keanu's supporters were rallying around him with even more fervor. There was something about Keanu's quiet strength that seemed to resonate deeply with people. They didn't just see him as an actor. They saw him as someone who had faced real struggles, someone who was authentic and grounded. And that, Charlie began to realize, was something he would never fully understand. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled Charlie became. He had spent years crafting a persona of boldness and unflinching criticism, but now, for the first time in a long while, he wondered if he had crossed a line. Was his cynicism really the answer? Was it possible that Keanu's approach, his silence, his kindness, his unwillingness to engage in petty conflict, was the true strength? As Charlie sat at his desk, staring at the growing backlash on social media, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. Charlie Dawson couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within him after his latest attack on Keanu Reeves. He had always prided himself on being the one to call out the flaws of the rich and famous, the one who would expose the hypocrisy of Hollywood's brightest stars. But something about Keanu's response, his calm silence, had thrown Charlie off balance. It wasn't just the media storm that followed. It was the way Keanu had handled the situation. The actor didn't stoop to Charlie's level. He didn't fire back with harsh words or retaliate in any way. Instead, he simply existed. He allowed the moment to breathe, letting the crowd and the cameras focus not on his response, but on their own expectations. And that silence spoke louder than any words ever could. In the days that followed, Charlie's social media feeds were flooded with reactions. Some were supportive, echoing Charlie's claims about Keanu being a fake celebrity, a man who only appeared humble to distract from his lack of real convictions. But others were different. People were defending Keanu, not just as an actor, but as a man who chose kindness over confrontation, who preferred silence to snark. Charlie had been prepared for backlash, but he wasn't prepared for the level of admiration Keanu was receiving. It wasn't just his fans who were defending him. It was people from all walks of life. Even in Charlie's own social circles, there were murmurs of doubt. Some colleagues, who had once cheered him on, now questioned whether he had crossed a line. The more Charlie thought about it, the more he realized that Keanu's quiet strength had touched a nerve in him. It made Charlie question the very foundation of his own approach to life and journalism. His entire career had been built on provocation and criticism, on calling out what he saw as the flaws in others. But Keanu's refusal to engage in the drama had forced him to confront something deeper. Was his cynicism really making a difference? Was tearing others down the best way to spark change? At night, alone in his apartment, Charlie found himself rereading the same article he had written about Keanu. With each word, the mockery seemed less justified. The idea that Keanu was somehow out of touch with the real world now felt less convincing. How could someone who quietly gave away his wealth to charity, who had endured personal losses with grace, really be accused of being fake? Charlie was, for the first time in a long while, at a crossroads. The bold, unapologetic journalist persona he had built over the years seemed to be at odds with the nagging feeling that perhaps he had made a mistake. But it wasn't just about his own career. There was something deeper, something that had been eating away at him for years. Behind the facade of bravado, Charlie had never felt truly connected to the world around him. His career, his constant need for validation, had been an escape from a deeper void he had never addressed. His relationship with his parents was distant, his friendship shallow, and his love life a series of fleeting encounters. The more successful he became, the lonelier he felt. Keanu's story, the way he had quietly faced hardship, the loss of his sister, his humble lifestyle despite his fame, resonated with Charlie in a way he didn't understand. It made him realize that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way to live. Maybe there was more to life than tearing people down for sport. Maybe Keanu had figured out something he had missed. The tension between Charlie's public persona and the doubts brewing within him continued to grow. He couldn't go back now, not after everything he had built. But as the days passed, the unease in his gut only intensified. Keanu, on the other hand, had been quiet. The media frenzy around the confrontation had died down, but the aftershocks lingered. Keanu wasn't just sitting idly by, though. Behind the scenes, he was reflecting on what had transpired. The mockery had hurt, of course. It always did. But he wasn't going to let it define him. He knew better than anyone how fleeting public opinion could be. In the end, it was the quiet moments, the real connections with people, that mattered. Yet, even as he moved forward with his usual peace, Keanu couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. There was something different about this moment, something that told him the narrative was about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. And this time, he wasn't sure whether it was going to be for better or worse. The tension was building. Charlie's internal conflict was starting to mirror the larger conflict between him and Keanu. The stage had been set for something bigger than either of them could have predicted. Would Charlie continue down the path of public criticism, or would he begin to reevaluate his own approach to life? And, more importantly, how would Keanu respond? For the first time in years, Charlie felt like he didn't have all the answers. It had been a week since Charlie Dawson's infamous interview with Keanu Reeves. The online world was still buzzing with heated debates about the confrontation. Charlie had spent the past few days trying to maintain his usual bravado, continuing to write his columns as if nothing had changed. But deep down, he could feel the cracks starting to show. It was one thing to stand behind his words in the face of public backlash, but another entirely to feel the weight of doubt creeping into his thoughts. One evening, as Charlie sat at his desk, staring at the empty screen in front of him, he felt the familiar urge to write. But this time, it wasn't the usual scathing commentary on the flaws of Hollywood celebrities. Instead, his fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain. He wasn't sure where this new direction would take him, but something inside him was pushing him to acknowledge the growing tension, both in the world around him and within himself. Is this really who I want to be? Charlie muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. A man who thrives on making others uncomfortable, tearing them down for the sake of a story? It was a question he had asked himself only in moments of weakness, but now, the question loomed over him like a storm cloud. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, felt hollow, and Keanu, with his quiet dignity and unwavering calm, had unknowingly forced Charlie to confront that emptiness. Charlie's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a notification from a social media app. Keanu Reeves responds to Charlie Dawson's viral interview. He clicked the notification, his heart pounding in his chest. Keanu's response was simple, almost understated, far from the explosive reply Charlie had anticipated. The post read, "Charlie, I respect your right to speak your mind. I hope that in doing so, you find peace and understanding. We all have our journeys, and mine has taught me that kindness and humility are far more powerful than mockery. Wishing you the best." It was brief, yet it carried an undeniable weight. Keanu wasn't just responding to Charlie's words. He was offering something far more profound, an invitation to reflect. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet, graceful acknowledgement of the situation. It was as if Keanu had turned the mirror around, forcing Charlie to confront the person he had become. For the first time in days, Charlie felt a rush of guilt. His initial reaction was one of disbelief. Was this really Keanu's response? No fiery retort, no call for vengeance, just a simple message of understanding. It left Charlie speechless, unable to immediately process what it meant. But as he sat there, staring at the screen, something shifted. The guilt that had been quietly gnawing at him began to crystallize into something more. A recognition that Keanu was right. Kindness and humility. These were qualities that had been missing from Charlie's own life for far too long. He had built his career on the foundation of criticism, cynicism, and provocation. But now, sitting in his quiet apartment, the truth was undeniable. He had been wrong. Charlie's thoughts swirled as he considered what he should do next. He could continue on with his usual routine, pretending that nothing had changed. He could write another scathing column, deflecting the weight of his own guilt by attacking again. But something inside him told him that wouldn't be enough. Something deep in his gut told him that it was time for him to change, even if it meant admitting that he had made a mistake. After a long moment of hesitation, Charlie opened a new document on his computer. His fingers hovered over the keys, unsure of where to begin. But as the words slowly started to form, the tone was clear. He wasn't writing to defend himself. He wasn't writing to attack Keanu or anyone else. He was writing to apologize. The apology was raw and honest, perhaps the most vulnerable piece of writing he had ever done. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his actions. He simply acknowledged the harm he had caused and the realization he had come to. That mocking others, especially someone like Keanu, was not the way forward. He admitted that he had been blinded by his own need for validation, and he expressed regret for the hurt his words had caused. Charlie ended the piece with a simple sentence. "I've spent my life pointing out flaws in others, but now I see the greatest flaw is the one I've been hiding from myself." When he finished, Charlie sat back in his chair and stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't know what would happen next. Would people accept his apology? Would they dismiss it as a publicity stunt or an act of weakness? He couldn't control the outcome. All he could do was speak the truth, even if it meant acknowledging that he had been wrong. Charlie hit publish, and within minutes, the article was live. He didn't have the energy to watch the immediate responses. He knew he would have to face whatever came next. But in that moment, he felt a sense of peace, a small but undeniable shift in his soul. It wasn't just the apology that felt significant. It was the recognition that he, too, was capable of change. For the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping away from the persona he had carefully constructed, the one that demanded confrontation at every turn. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to tear someone else down to lift himself up. The wait for the public's response would be long, but Charlie didn't feel the usual anxiety that came with uncertainty. Instead, he felt an unexpected lightness, a freedom he hadn't known in a long time. Keanu Reeves had never been one to seek the spotlight. His life had always been marked by a deep sense of inner peace, the kind that came not from success or fame, but from a quiet conviction that there was more to life than what met the eye. In his response to Charlie Dawson, Keanu had remained true to this philosophy. He wasn't interested in adding fuel to the fire or engaging in the drama. Instead, he chose to meet Charlie's mockery with a graceful, almost effortless message of compassion. The aftermath of the viral interview had been a curious thing for Keanu. On the surface, everything seemed like business as usual. He was still the same actor, the same person he had always been. Yet, beneath the calm demeanor, there was a quiet transformation happening. He wasn't just going to let this moment pass. The world, it seemed, was ready to listen, and Keanu was ready to share something deeper, something more than just the on-screen persona that had captivated millions. The public's reaction to Charlie's scathing remarks had been swift and intense. The internet had exploded, with people either defending Keanu or supporting Charlie's critique. But amid the noise, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Keanu's response had touched something fundamental in people. It was as if his ability to remain composed, to resist the urge to lash out, had made people reconsider their own behavior and their own interactions. 4 days after Charlie's interview, Keanu's inbox had been flooded with messages. Some were from fans, expressing gratitude for his calm and dignity. Others were from celebrities, reaching out with their support, recognizing the strength it took to rise above the drama. But there was one message that stood out among the rest. It was from a young journalist named Emma, who had been following Charlie Dawson's career closely. "I'm writing to you," Emma's message began, "because I've been following this entire ordeal with Charlie. It seems like you've handled it with such grace, and I wanted to tell you that it's inspired me more than I can say. I've been in the journalism business for a few years now, and I've often found myself caught up in the sensationalism and negativity. But I want to change that. I want to write stories that matter, stories that help people. Your response to Charlie made me realize how much I've lost sight of that." Keanu read the message several times, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was as if Emma had given voice to the quiet revolution he had been feeling within himself. His simple response to Charlie had started a ripple effect, one that had touched not just his fans but also the people behind the scenes, those in the business of shaping narratives and telling stories. Keanu didn't have all the answers, but he knew that this was a moment that had the potential to change the conversation. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of a new kind of media. A media that wasn't driven by controversy, scandal, and outrage, but by truth, kindness, and genuine human connection. And if it was going to happen, he wanted to be part of that change. The idea began to take root in Keanu's mind. He would begin speaking out, but not in the way people expected. He wouldn't engage in petty back-and-forths or arguments. Instead, he would use his platform to encourage others to approach the world with more empathy and understanding. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. It was about shifting the conversation to something more meaningful than the usual drama. Keanu spent the next few days reflecting on how best to approach this new direction. He didn't want to rush into anything. It had to be done thoughtfully, with care, in a way that was true to who he was. He started working with his public relations team to carefully craft a series of messages that he would share on social media, ones that focused on positivity, on encouraging others to embrace the values of kindness, humility, and personal growth. The first of these posts came a few days later. Keanu shared a picture of himself sitting quietly in nature, a peaceful smile on his face. The caption read, "In a world that often seems driven by noise, it's important to remember the power of silence. Let's take a moment to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves. It's in these moments of stillness that we find our true strength. Wishing you all peace and clarity in your journeys." The response was immediate. Fans and followers flooded his comments with messages of support. But what was even more striking were the messages from those who had never expressed admiration for Keanu before. Many people in the media world, including some of the most outspoken critics of celebrities, reached out to express how much they had been impacted by Keanu's words. Some even admitted that they had been too caught up in their own cynicism to see the value in his message. One such message came from a senior editor at a major news outlet, someone who had long been a critic of Hollywood's superficiality. "Keanu," the message began, I've spent years covering the celebrity machine and being part of the noise. I can't tell you how much your recent message resonated with me. I'm going to start asking myself what kind of stories I want to write moving forward. Thank you for being a quiet but powerful voice of change." Keanu sat back after reading the message, his heart full. He wasn't trying to lead any revolution, but somehow, he had found himself at the forefront of one. His message wasn't about attacking the system. It was about offering an alternative, a different way of approaching the world. And in a time when negativity seemed to be the driving force in both media and everyday life, Keanu's example was like a breath of fresh air. And it wasn't just the public that was taking notice. Charlie Dawson, too, was quietly grappling with the aftermath of his attack on Keanu. He had written his apology, yes, but now the real work of reflection had begun. Charlie had seen Keanu's message and felt something stir inside him. It was as if Keanu's words had cut through the noise that Charlie had spent years contributing to. The apology was just the beginning, but Charlie realized he had to take it further. He had to change how he approached his work, not just for the sake of his career, but for his own peace of mind. The paths of Keanu and Charlie were slowly, quietly, beginning to intersect once more. Neither of them knew what would come next, but one thing was certain. The events of the past week had set something in motion. And whatever happened next, it would be something neither of them could have predicted. Charlie Dawson had never been one to shy away from controversy. For years, he had built his career on taking bold, often harsh stands, attacking celebrities and public figures with the sharpest of words. His columns, often fueled by a mixture of cynicism and ambition, had earned him both a devoted following and a fair share of detractors. Yet, with each passing day after his public confrontation with Keanu Reeves, something had begun to gnaw at him, something he had never quite felt before: self-doubt. Charlie's apology had been met with mixed reactions. Some fans had lauded him for owning up to his mistakes and showing vulnerability, while others had dismissed it as an act of weakness, perhaps even a calculated move to save his career. The professional critics, however, were silent. His usual platform, where he had once thrived on the praise of fellow journalists and the applause of online audiences, had become eerily quiet. It felt like a ghost town in his corner of the media world. The silence was maddening. Charlie had always been the one who controlled the narrative. He would go after a celebrity, write a scathing column, and within hours, the public would respond with fervor. He was accustomed to being in the center of the storm, generating buzz and dominating conversations. But now, after his apology to Keanu, it was as if the storm had moved on without him. The tide had shifted, and Charlie had no idea how to adjust to the calm. Keanu, on the other hand, had continued his quiet revolution. His messages of peace, kindness, and reflection were slowly gaining traction, not just with his fans, but with people from all walks of life. It was subtle at first, like ripples in a pond, but it was beginning to spread. People were talking more about the power of silence, the importance of kindness in a world full of noise. Keanu wasn't leading a crusade. He wasn't asking anyone to follow him, but his example was a compelling one. Charlie, who had long prided himself on being an agent of change through criticism, now found himself caught in the middle of a narrative he couldn't control. The world was starting to look at him differently. They weren't interested in his attacks anymore. They were questioning him, wondering if the man behind the words was someone they could respect. The anger he had so frequently stirred in others seemed less relevant now. People were starting to crave a new direction, a more constructive dialogue. As days turned into weeks, Charlie's anxiety grew. He couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's message, the one that had seemed so simple, so humble, yet had pierced through the layers of bravado and arrogance Charlie had built around himself. It wasn't the content of the message that had affected him. It was the tone. The unspoken message in Keanu's words was this: there's a better way to live. Charlie began to take long walks, trying to clear his head, trying to make sense of what was happening to him. The noise of the city, cars honking, people shouting, the hum of technology, felt stifling. For the first time in years, he found himself longing for silence, longing to think deeply about who he was and what kind of person he wanted to be. One afternoon, as Charlie sat in a small cafe, nursing his coffee, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was another message from Keanu, a post shared on social media. It read, "True change begins when we stop looking for flaws in others and start looking for the good. We all have a story, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen." It wasn't the first time Keanu had shared such sentiments, but this message felt different. It resonated with Charlie in a way that none of the others had. The words true change hit him hard. Was it possible that the change Keanu was speaking of had already begun in him? Had the seeds of transformation been planted, not by anyone else, but by his own reflection and the vulnerability he had shown in his apology? Charlie could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that this wasn't just about the public spectacle anymore. This was about something deeper, something far more personal. If he wanted to make a real difference in the world, if he wanted to truly shift the narrative, it couldn't come from tearing others down. It had to come from building something up, starting with himself. For the first time, Charlie began to think about his work differently. He had always considered himself a journalist with a mission: to expose the truth, to call out injustice, and to challenge the status quo. But now, he wondered if there was another kind of truth he had been missing. Was it possible that true journalism wasn't just about pointing fingers, but about giving people the space to tell their own stories? Was it about fostering understanding rather than amplifying division? That evening, Charlie sat down and wrote his first new article since his apology. This time, there was no scorn in his words, no biting critique. Instead, he wrote about the power of listening, the importance of empathy, and the need for genuine connection in a world dominated by noise. He shared his own journey, how he had learned that criticism, while powerful, was not the only tool at his disposal. He admitted that he had spent too much of his life focusing on what was wrong with the world and not enough time appreciating what was right. When he finished the article, Charlie sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. It was the most vulnerable piece of writing he had ever done, but it was also the most honest. He clicked publish. As the article went live, Charlie's phone buzzed with notifications. At first, there were just a few likes, a couple of comments. But then, as hours passed, the response started to grow. It wasn't just the usual fans or critics weighing in. It was people from all over, sharing their own stories, talking about how they, too, had been caught up in the cycle of negativity and wanted to do something different. Charlie realized that his shift wasn't just about changing the tone of his writing. It was about changing the way he connected with the world. The feedback was overwhelming, but in a way that felt comforting rather than validating. He wasn't seeking approval anymore. He was just sharing his truth, hoping that, by doing so, others might be inspired to do the same. Meanwhile, Keanu continued his quiet revolution, remaining steadfast in his message of peace. Though he was unaware of the full extent of Charlie's transformation, he could sense that something was shifting. There was a subtle energy in the air, a feeling that change was happening not just in the media, but in the hearts and minds of people everywhere. The two men, in their separate worlds, had unknowingly started something powerful, something bigger than themselves. Keanu had sparked a quiet movement, and Charlie, now embracing that same silence, had taken the first step on his own journey of change. The world was beginning to listen. The days following Charlie's article were unlike any he had experienced in his career. The response had been unlike anything he had expected. Instead of the usual rush of criticism and judgment, people were thanking him. Journalists, critics, and even fans of his who had once followed his sharp critiques were now expressing appreciation for his honesty and vulnerability. It was clear. People were hungry for a new kind of conversation, one that didn't focus on tearing others down, but on lifting them up. For Charlie, the response was both validating and humbling. In his years of writing, he had never felt so exposed, so raw, but he also felt a sense of liberation he had never known before. The weight of his past cynicism, the constant need to provoke, was starting to lift, replaced by something quieter but far more powerful: purpose. He spent the next few days reflecting on his career. For years, he had been a fixture of the media's toxic cycle, driven by the need to remain relevant through controversy. He had thought of himself as a voice of truth, calling out the flaws in others, but now, he realized how many of those flaws had been projections of his own insecurities. Keanu's words had gotten under his skin. and now he understood them more deeply than ever. True change begins when we stop looking for flaws in others and start looking for the good. Keanu had offered him something precious without ever intending to. An opportunity to change the way he saw the world and, in turn, change the way the world saw him. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves was continuing his quiet crusade. But something had shifted for him as well. After his simple, gracious response to Charlie's mocking interview, Keanu had expected the moment to pass, like so many others. Yet, in the days that followed, he saw the ripple effects of his words. Messages of gratitude, quiet thank yous, and notes of solidarity flooded his inbox. Fans and strangers alike had reached out, telling him how his response had inspired them to be more patient, more understanding, and more empathetic in their own lives. It wasn't just about his response to Charlie anymore. It was about the message it carried, the message that kindness could be more powerful than mockery. It was a lesson that resonated with people across all walks of life, from high-profile celebrities to regular people dealing with everyday struggles. Keanu had never set out to be a leader, but that's exactly what he was becoming. And then came the message from Charlie. Charlie's apology article, humble and honest, was the turning point Keanu had unknowingly been waiting for. Keanu had seen the headlines, watched the public response, and felt a quiet satisfaction that Charlie had taken responsibility for his words. But it was the article itself that struck him. In it, Charlie spoke about his own transformation, his realization that the world didn't need more negativity, but more understanding. It was the kind of self-reflection Keanu had hoped for when he first responded with kindness instead of fire. Keanu didn't think twice before responding. He reached out to Charlie with a simple message. "Charlie, I read your article. It was brave. We all have the potential to change. I'm proud of you for finding that path. Let's continue this conversation in person someday. Wishing you all the best on your journey." Keanu didn't expect a reply. In truth, he had no agenda other than offering encouragement. What he didn't know, however, was that this small message would set in motion an unexpected meeting. A few days after Keanu's message, Charlie found himself sitting at a small cafe in downtown Los Angeles, nervously tapping his fingers on the wooden table. It had taken him a while to work up the courage to respond to Keanu. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself, like an actor stepping onto a stage for the first time, unsure of how the audience would react. The message from Keanu had been simple but deeply meaningful. The invitation to meet in person was something Charlie had never expected. After all, they were from different worlds. Keanu, the beloved actor with a reputation for humility, and Charlie, the journalist who had made a career of criticizing celebrities. And yet, here they were, on the verge of a face-to-face conversation. When Keanu walked in, Charlie barely recognized him at first. The man who sat down across from him was not the Keanu Reeves of action movies or tabloid headlines. He was just a man, quiet, composed, and with an aura of kindness that seemed to fill the space around him. Keanu greeted Charlie with a warm smile, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence between them. Neither man knew quite where to begin. "Thanks for agreeing to meet," Charlie said, his voice a little nervous. "I wasn't sure if you'd even want to after everything." Keanu shrugged lightly, his eyes soft. "No reason to avoid it. I think we both understand the power of words, for better or worse." Charlie nodded, reflecting on his own recent journey. "You were right. I've spent so much time focusing on the flaws in others that I never stopped to look at my own. I think I was hiding behind criticism because I didn't want to face what was inside me." Keanu smiled gently, as if he had known all along. It's a difficult thing to admit, but it's also the first step toward real change. For the next hour, the two men talked. There was no animosity between them, no lingering bitterness over the past. Instead, there was an open, honest conversation about their own struggles, their vulnerabilities, and the journey they were each on. Keanu shared stories of his own life, of how he had learned to embrace stillness, kindness, and humility despite the pressures of fame. Charlie, in turn, spoke about the doubts he had been grappling with, the fear of losing his career if he gave up his hard-edged persona. By the time they parted ways, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Keanu had helped Charlie see a path forward, one that didn't require him to give up his identity as a journalist, but to change the way he used his voice. Charlie realized that he didn't have to tear others down to make an impact. He could build people up, share their stories, and make the world a better place through his words. Keanu, for his part, left the meeting feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He didn't know where his quiet revolution would go, but he knew that it had sparked something in Charlie, and that was enough. Over the next few months, Charlie's career began to shift in ways he had never anticipated. His columns no longer focused on the sharp critiques he had once been known for. Instead, they explored deeper, more meaningful subjects: the importance of empathy, the power of silence, and the value of understanding others. The audience that had once flocked to his provocative writing began to respect him for his thoughtful approach and his willingness to admit his past mistakes. Keanu continued to lead by example, speaking about kindness in interviews, supporting charitable causes, and encouraging others to focus on the positive. Neither man sought the spotlight. Rather, they both let their actions speak for themselves. Together, though unknowingly linked, they had begun to change the conversation in the media world. Through their shared journey of self-reflection and growth, they had learned that the true power of words was not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. And in that quiet revolution, they had found something far more lasting than fame or recognition: true peace. As the months passed, both Keanu and Charlie found themselves at the crossroads of a profound personal transformation. The ripple effect of their encounter, one born of humility, vulnerability, and a quiet understanding, was beginning to shape the media landscape in unexpected ways. The world, it seemed, was finally beginning to listen to the message they had both unknowingly started. Charlie, once known for his provocative and often harsh writing, was now becoming a voice for reflection and change. His new approach, focusing on empathy and understanding, resonated deeply with readers. Articles that once tore down the status quo were now examining the complexities of human connection, the deep-seated need for compassion, and the power of silence in a world filled with noise. His career, which had seemed in peril after his public confrontation with Keanu, was flourishing in an entirely new direction. What had initially been perceived as a moment of weakness had become his moment of strength. As Charlie's new writing gained traction, his influence began to grow. He was invited to speak at panels and media conferences about the power of shifting narratives, about how journalism and media could serve a higher purpose. He didn't shy away from discussing the past, from explaining the shift he had undergone, and how Keanu's words had opened his eyes to a different way of engaging with the world. His story was no longer just about a public feud. It was about personal evolution, the redemption of a man who had been shaped by his own mistakes. Charlie even began mentoring young journalists, guiding them to write not just for clicks, but for meaningful change. He reminded them that the pen could still be mightier than the sword, but only if it was used with integrity, honesty, and a deep sense of responsibility. The transformation he had undergone had given him a new sense of purpose, and he was determined to help others see the value of thoughtful, positive storytelling. For Keanu, the changes were subtler but no less significant. His quiet revolution had, by all accounts, reshaped his public persona. He had long been known for his humility and kindness, but now, his actions spoke louder than ever. Keanu wasn't the type to flaunt his influence, but his gentle words about the power of silence, empathy, and understanding were being shared far and wide. He continued to speak about the importance of kindness in interviews, but he also took concrete actions to support the causes that mattered most to him. Keanu was involved in numerous charitable initiatives, focusing on mental health, homelessness, and education. He had long been a philanthropist, but now his efforts were becoming more public. It wasn't about recognition for him. It was about making a tangible impact on the world, helping those who needed it most. One of Keanu's most meaningful projects was a series of grants he established for young filmmakers from underprivileged backgrounds. His idea was simple: to give them the resources to tell their stories and bring their visions to life. Keanu had always been deeply passionate about storytelling, and he believed that every voice deserved to be heard. Through these grants, he hoped to give those voices a platform in the industry that had given him so much. Keanu's commitment to giving back became a powerful testament to his values. It wasn't about being in the spotlight for him. It was about creating lasting change. His actions spoke louder than any word he could write or say, and his reputation for generosity and humility continued to grow. Keanu was more than just a beloved actor. He had become a symbol of the quiet power of kindness in an increasingly loud world. Then came the day when the two men, who had once been at odds, found themselves standing side by side at an event neither of them had anticipated. The Media for Change conference was being held in Los Angeles, an event aimed at reshaping the role of media in society. The conference was about redefining the responsibility of journalists and influencers to create narratives that uplifted and empowered rather than divided. It was here that Charlie had been invited to speak on a panel about the future of journalism. He was expected to share his journey of transformation and the impact Keanu's words had on his career. Charlie was surprised when Keanu was also announced as a keynote speaker. While Keanu wasn't a journalist, his impact on the industry and his message about kindness had been impossible to ignore. The two men would be sharing the stage, not as adversaries, but as partners in the quiet revolution that had begun months before. The day of the event, the room was packed. Journalists, media personalities, influencers, and even a few celebrities filled the auditorium. There was an air of excitement, something rare in these types of events. The audience was curious about the conversation that would unfold between Keanu and Charlie. Would they talk about their past conflict? Would the tension still be palpable? As Charlie took the stage first, he spoke with a calm authority that came from deep reflection. He talked about the dangers of sensationalism, the toll it took on both the public and the individuals involved. He shared how Keanu's simple response to mockery had caused him to reevaluate his approach to writing, and how he now saw the power of words in a new light. "It's easy to mock someone from a distance," Charlie said, his voice steady. "It's easy to tear them down in pursuit of an audience's applause. But true strength isn't in tearing down others. True strength is in finding the courage to lift them up." The audience listened intently, the silence in the room a testament to the weight of his words. When Keanu took the stage, he was greeted with warm applause. His presence was calm, grounded, almost meditative. He spoke not as a Hollywood star, but as a man who had lived through his own struggles and had learned to embrace the stillness of life. He echoed much of what Charlie had said, emphasizing that the world needed less noise and more listening. "There's so much to hear if we just take the time to listen," Keanu said softly. "The world is filled with stories waiting to be told. We just have to be quiet enough to hear them." Keanu's words had the same impact as they always did, simple, yet profound. His message wasn't just for the audience in the room, but for everyone who would read about the event later. It was a reminder that kindness, humility, and listening were the true foundations of connection. When the two men spoke together, it felt like a harmonious conversation. The tension that had once existed between them had evaporated, replaced by a shared commitment to change. They talked about the media's responsibility to elevate, rather than exploit. They spoke about the importance of personal growth and the power of vulnerability. And most importantly, they talked about the need for a new kind of journalism, one that valued empathy over sensationalism. The audience left the conference buzzing with energy, inspired by the words they had heard. There was a sense that something big had just started to shift in the media world. Charlie and Keanu had become symbols of a new era, one that focused on positive change, humility, and the quiet power of understanding. As the day ended, Charlie and Keanu stood together backstage, looking out at the sea of people leaving the event. Neither of them had expected this moment, but both knew that it was the culmination of something far bigger than either of them. "Thank you," Charlie said, turning to Keanu, "for everything. You've changed my life more than you know." Keanu smiled, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "It's all about the journey, my friend. We're all just trying to find our way." And with that, the two men, once divided by criticism and misunderstanding, stood together, united by a quiet but powerful truth. Change starts with a single act of kindness, and from there, it can change the world. And so, their legacy continued, not in the headlines or the accolades, but in the quiet, meaningful impact they had on the world around them. Through their actions, their words, and their unwavering commitment to kindness, Keanu and Charlie had shown the world that the true power of media wasn't in the noise it made, but in the silence it could offer. The silence that allowed space for understanding, growth, and connection. It was, after all, the quiet revolution. The Media for Change conference marked a pivotal moment in both Charlie and Keanu's journeys, but it wasn't just a turning point for them. It had ignited a ripple effect that would spread far beyond their immediate circles. As the conference buzzed with energy, it was clear that something larger was at play. The dialogue they had sparked, one rooted in empathy, understanding, and the pursuit of authenticity, began to permeate the media landscape in ways neither of them could have anticipated. For Charlie, the aftermath of the conference was overwhelming in the best possible way. His inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, critics, and even former adversaries. The industry was taking notice. Longtime media figures who had once criticized him for being too confrontational were now expressing their admiration for his newfound voice. Many journalists reached out, sharing their own struggles with the pressures of sensationalism, wondering how they, too, could navigate the complex world of media while staying true to their values. Charlie had become a beacon of hope for those who were tired of the constant cycle of negativity. His story of transformation, his willingness to admit his mistakes and evolve into someone more reflective, had inspired countless people. But with this newfound recognition came a responsibility he hadn't fully anticipated. He began receiving invitations to speak at universities, to give lectures on the importance of empathy in journalism, and to lead workshops for aspiring writers. For the first time in his career, Charlie felt a true sense of purpose. His words weren't just for clicks or for fueling the endless cycle of news. They were meant to serve something bigger, to foster understanding, and to create a space where people could connect through their shared humanity. As he prepared for a speaking engagement at a university in New York, Charlie took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The idea of standing in front of a room full of young, eager minds and speaking about kindness, about using one's voice to build, not destroy, was both humbling and surreal. He had spent so many years cultivating a persona built on being the sharp-tongued critic. Now, he was becoming something else entirely, a mentor, a guide, a catalyst for change. Keanu, too, was experiencing the ripple effects of the message he and Charlie had shared at the conference. His quiet commitment to philanthropy and kindness had always been a part of his life, but now it was becoming more public. The media, which had long been obsessed with his stoic demeanor and the often misunderstood narrative of his personal life, was starting to embrace a new story about Keanu Reeves, one of generosity, thoughtfulness, and a quiet desire to make the world a better place. The stories about Keanu's charitable work started gaining traction in the press, but in a way that was different from the usual celebrity news. There were no flashy headlines or sensationalized claims. Instead, the articles focused on the impact of his actions, the scholarships he funded for aspiring filmmakers, the mental health initiatives he supported, and the countless times he had quietly helped people in need without seeking recognition. Keanu's actions were speaking for themselves, and the world was starting to listen. As the months went on, Keanu found himself being invited to speak at more public events, not as an actor, but as a thought leader and advocate for kindness. He took part in panel discussions about the power of media to heal rather than harm. He collaborated with various organizations dedicated to helping marginalized communities, advocating for mental health awareness, and supporting the arts. At one event, Keanu stood on a stage with a group of other well-known figures in the charity world. As they discussed the importance of using influence for good, Keanu shared his thoughts on the need for authenticity in both personal and public life. "We all have the capacity to make a difference," Keanu said, his voice steady and clear. "It doesn't take fame, fortune, or power. It takes intention. The intention to listen, to act with compassion, and to stand up for those who don't have a voice. That's where real change happens." The room fell silent as Keanu spoke. There was a quiet reverence in the air, a deep respect for the sincerity that radiated from him. It wasn't the first time he had shared such sentiments, but it was becoming clear that his message was resonating more deeply with people than ever before. But the ripple effect of their collaboration went even further. Both Keanu and Charlie had touched a much wider audience than they could have imagined. The social media landscape, which had once been a battleground for inflammatory comments and viral arguments, began to shift. The tone of online conversations started changing. People who had once engaged in heated debates and divisive arguments began to reflect more deeply on the words they used. Hashtags like hashtag speak with kindness, hashtag empathy in action, and hashtag build not destroy began trending across various platforms. What started as a single conversation between two men, one a journalist, the other a Hollywood icon, had turned into a global movement. It wasn't about creating a new set of rules or demanding that people be perfect in their interactions. It was about creating space for more thoughtful, meaningful exchanges and encouraging others to be mindful of the power their words held. Charlie's influence in this shift was significant. His transformation from a sharp-tongued critic to a champion of empathy gave others permission to reflect on their own behaviors. Young journalists, in particular, were beginning to embrace a new model of storytelling, one that prioritized truth, compassion, and a genuine desire to connect with people rather than stir the pot. For Keanu, the shift was just as profound. As the media started to look beyond his persona as a celebrity and instead focused on his actions and intentions, Keanu found that he was being asked to lend his voice to causes he deeply cared about. He spoke about mental health, using his platform to break down the stigma surrounding it. He worked with organizations that helped young people facing homelessness, making sure that their stories were heard and that their struggles didn't go unnoticed. Together, Charlie and Keanu had sparked something that neither of them could have imagined: a cultural shift toward empathy, authenticity, and kindness. They had shown the world that it wasn't about perfection or fame. It was about being human and taking responsibility for how we treat each other. The most unexpected consequence of all, however, was the connection that had formed between the two men. Keanu and Charlie's relationship had evolved from a tense encounter into a true friendship. They had shared so much: stories of personal growth, reflections on their work, and insights into the challenges they both faced in the public eye. As they sat together one evening, having dinner at a quiet restaurant, Charlie smiled as he looked across the table at Keanu. "You know," Charlie said, "I never would have imagined that the path I'm on now would have led me here. It's kind of surreal, actually, but I wouldn't change a thing." Keanu returned the smile, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "I think we're both just doing the best we can," he said softly. "And that's enough. We don't need to have all the answers, but we can try to make a difference where we are." Charlie nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this place. One of quiet reflection, of meaningful work, and of the lasting impact they had made together. It had all started with a single moment of humility, and now, the ripple effects of that moment were being felt around the world. And as Keanu and Charlie shared a quiet moment of understanding, they both knew that the world was a little bit better because they had dared to take the first step toward change. As the year unfolded, the world began to reflect the changes initiated by Charlie and Keanu's efforts. It was no longer just about what they had done or said. It was about the movement they had unknowingly created. Their message was resonating on a global scale, and the impact continued to ripple outward in ways that no one could have predicted. For Charlie, the media landscape was evolving in a way that felt both comforting and challenging. As more journalists embraced the idea of responsible, compassionate storytelling, there were growing pains. Some were skeptical of this shift, worried that it would dilute the very essence of what made journalism impactful. But Charlie stood firm, knowing that this new way was the future. In the midst of the debate, he found himself at the center of a larger conversation about what it meant to be a journalist in the 21st century. He received countless invitations to discuss his views on public panels and in media interviews. His story, the transformation from sharp critique to reflective empathy, was now one of inspiration. For the first time in his life, Charlie felt a sense of peace with his work. It wasn't about sensationalism anymore. It was about bringing clarity to the world, about offering perspective rather than just criticism. In one of his interviews, Charlie was asked about the greatest lesson he had learned in his journey. "I've learned that our words have power, more than we often realize. We can choose to tear down or build up. I used to believe that pushing people to their limits was the way to get a reaction, to make a story stand out. But I've come to see that true impact comes from the quiet, steady work of building bridges, not burning them," he said thoughtfully. "It's about creating a space where people feel seen, heard, and understood. That's where change begins." Keanu's influence had quietly spread through the public. His message of compassion and kindness was no longer an abstract concept. It had become a guiding principle for many who were searching for a way to navigate an increasingly chaotic world. Keanu had always been elusive about his personal life, and now he had become even more so, not out of secrecy, but because he no longer sought validation in the external world. His focus was inward, on the quiet work of making a difference. In a rare interview, Keanu shared his thoughts on the importance of silence in a world filled with noise. Silence isn't empty. It's full of possibility, he explained. It's in those moments of stillness that we can really hear each other, that we can connect with the truths that matter most. The world often tells us that we need to be louder, to stand out. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is listen. Keanu's words resonated with many who were exhausted by the ceaseless noise of modern life. His message was a reminder that change didn't have to be loud to be effective. It could be quiet, gradual, and still powerful. One of the most profound changes, however, came in the form of a series of collaborative projects between Charlie and Keanu. They had begun working together on a documentary series exploring the transformative power of empathy in the media. They traveled to various communities, meeting with individuals who had experienced hardship, suffering, and loss. They sought out stories not to sensationalize, but to highlight the humanity of those involved. The documentary was not an easy project. It was filled with raw, unfiltered emotion as they explored the lives of people who had faced unimaginable challenges. But it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Through the series, Charlie and Keanu revealed the importance of listening, of connecting with others on a deep, personal level, and of telling stories that brought people together rather than dividing them. The documentary became a critical success, not because it offered sensationalized tales of triumph over adversity, but because it portrayed the complexity and nuance of human experience. It was a reflection of the very principles Charlie and Keanu had come to value: authenticity, empathy, and the quiet power of connection. Through the film, Keanu and Charlie demonstrated how the media could be a force for good. It was no longer about pushing boundaries for the sake of controversy. It was about telling stories that mattered, that could inspire, heal, and unite. As their work continued to gain recognition, Charlie and Keanu found themselves invited to international events, becoming ambassadors of the very movement they had started. They were no longer just two men with a shared story. They had become representatives of a larger cultural shift, one that was calling for empathy and authenticity in a world that had grown too accustomed to cynicism and division. One evening, as they stood together at a charity gala in London, Charlie looked over at Keanu, a quiet sense of gratitude filling him. "I never would have imagined any of this, you know?" Charlie said, shaking his head in disbelief. Keanu smiled, his calm demeanor unchanged. "I think that's the beauty of it," he replied. "Sometimes, the most powerful things we do are the ones we never expect. It's like a ripple in a pond. We never see the full extent of the waves we create, but they reach farther than we think." Charlie nodded, looking out over the crowd. "Yeah, it's kind of like that. This whole journey. I never thought it would lead here. But now that it has, I can't imagine doing anything else." Keanu's expression softened. "We're doing the work we're meant to do," he said simply. "And that's enough." The movement they had started continued to grow, as more and more people embraced the idea of a media landscape built on empathy and understanding. Journalism, once seen as an industry driven by sensationalism and competition, was slowly evolving into something more meaningful, a space where stories of humanity could be told with care and compassion. But the most powerful change of all was the way that Charlie and Keanu's message was reaching people on a personal level. It wasn't just about changing the media or the world. It was about changing hearts and minds. The idea that kindness, authenticity, and empathy could heal divisions was catching fire in all corners of society. People were beginning to realize that they, too, had the power to make a difference. Whether it was through their words, their actions, or their willingness to listen, they could create a ripple effect of their own. And for Charlie and Keanu, the quiet revolution they had begun was just the beginning. As they stood side by side, their paths forever intertwined, they knew that the real work was only just beginning. The journey toward empathy, understanding, and kindness was ongoing, and they were committed to walking that path, one step at a time. The legacy they had started, through their words, their actions, and their example, was more than just a movement. It was a new way of being, a new way of seeing the world. And as long as there were people willing to listen, to learn, and to change, their message would continue to echo throughout the world, creating ripples that would last for generations to come. Months passed, and the ripple effect Charlie and Keanu had created continued to reverberate through both the media world and beyond. It wasn't just a momentary shift. It had become a lasting change, with new conversations blossoming in schools, boardrooms, and living rooms everywhere. But with this growth came the undeniable truth that every movement, every shift in society, would eventually face its crossroads. For Charlie and Keanu, the path ahead was no longer as clear as it had once seemed. As the duo's influence spread, they began to receive invitations from larger, more powerful institutions. Corporations, political figures, and even other media moguls sought them out, hoping to either align themselves with the movement they represented or to use their influence to further their own agendas. It was flattering at first. After all, their message was now being embraced at the highest levels of power. But as the invitations grew in frequency, so too did the doubts in their minds. Charlie, who had once lived in the fast-paced, high-stakes world of sensational journalism, felt a growing discomfort with the way his message was being co-opted. At first, it was small things, a brand using his quotes in their ad campaigns, a political leader adopting phrases from his speeches without any true understanding of the message behind them. But soon, it became clear that his words were being twisted, packaged, and sold, no longer representing the values he had fought so hard to champion. Keanu, on the other hand, had always been careful about maintaining his distance from the limelight, and the increasing attention was beginning to make him uneasy. He had always been driven by an inner sense of purpose, never seeking to profit from his work or garner accolades. Now, with his influence being sought by everyone from non-profit organizations to Hollywood studios, he wondered if his message of quiet strength was being lost in the noise. One evening, as the two of them sat down for dinner at a quiet restaurant in Los Angeles, the weight of these concerns became unavoidable. "I've been thinking a lot about the direction things are going," Charlie said, pushing his plate away slightly. "We've built something meaningful, something real. But now, it's starting to feel like it's being turned into a brand. I don't know if I want that." Keanu looked at him thoughtfully, his expression calm but contemplative. "I hear you," he said after a moment of silence. "It's like the more we try to do good, the more others want to use our message for their own purposes. It's strange." Charlie leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "And it's not just the corporations. It's the media, too. They want a piece of the story, but they don't want the responsibility that comes with it. They want to use us as a symbol, without understanding the deeper meaning of what we're saying." Keanu nodded slowly. "I've always believed that real change comes from the inside out. But if we're not careful, we can become part of the system we were trying to change in the first place." The conversation lingered in the air, as both men realized they were standing at a crossroads. They had created something that was powerful, that had changed lives and inspired countless people to take action. But now, they faced a dilemma. Continue down the path they were on, which promised fame, recognition, and influence, or take a step back, preserving the integrity of their message and reclaiming the quiet, purposeful lives they had always valued. For Charlie, the decision weighed heavily. He had already seen firsthand how easily the media could twist a message. The recent headlines that had followed their documentary were a mix of praise and exploitation. Headlines like "Keanu and Charlie, the new faces of empathy," and "From journalists to heroes, how Keanu and Charlie are changing the world," had started to make him uneasy. They weren't the messages he wanted to be sending into the world. He had spent so much of his life chasing the approval of the media, constantly battling for a bigger story. Now that he had found a way to tell stories that truly mattered, he was unsure if he wanted to return to a system that had so often felt shallow and destructive. And then there was Keanu. Despite his public persona, Keanu had always been someone who preferred the simplicity of small, personal actions. He didn't want to be a symbol of anything. He didn't need to be idolized or revered. He simply wanted to live in a way that aligned with his values, quietly making a difference without fanfare. As the attention around him grew, he couldn't help but wonder if it was distracting from the very essence of his message. The choice ahead wasn't easy. Both of them had seen what true influence looked like. The kind that came from personal connection, from speaking truth to power, from inspiring others to live more authentically. They had seen how their story had sparked a worldwide conversation about kindness, empathy, and responsible media. But they had also seen how easily that story could be hijacked. Keanu broke the silence. "Maybe we're meant to step back," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet certainty. "Maybe it's time to walk away from the spotlight, not because we failed, but because we've done what we set out to do. And now, it's time for others to carry it forward." Charlie studied Keanu's face, reading the calm resolve there. He had always known that Keanu was someone who didn't seek approval or validation. And in that moment, Charlie felt a deep sense of clarity. They had both done what they needed to do. They had lit a spark, but the fire was now burning on its own. It was time to let go. The following weeks were filled with difficult conversations. They discussed what their future roles would be, how they could continue to support the movement they had started without becoming part of the machine they had once criticized. They were determined to ensure that the message of empathy and authenticity remained the center of everything they did. For Charlie, that meant stepping back from the public eye. He declined several speaking engagements, turned down lucrative offers from corporations, and focused instead on smaller, more intimate gatherings where he could continue to foster meaningful conversations without the weight of celebrity surrounding him. Keanu took a similar path. He withdrew from major media appearances, choosing instead to focus on quietly supporting charitable organizations that aligned with his values. He began teaching acting workshops for young filmmakers, encouraging them to tell stories that were grounded in truth and empathy, not sensationalism. Together, they spent time in various communities, connecting with those whose stories had been overlooked, helping amplify voices that had long been ignored. They didn't need the media to tell their story anymore. They were content to let their actions speak for themselves. As the years went by, Charlie and Keanu's decision proved to be the right one. The movement they had sparked continued to grow, driven by those who had taken their message and made it their own. Young journalists, filmmakers, activists, and everyday people had begun to embody the values of empathy and authenticity. They had carried the torch that Charlie and Keanu had lit, and in doing so, they had ensured that the message would continue to echo long after the two men had faded from the public eye. In the end, Charlie and Keanu didn't need fame or recognition. They had found peace in knowing that the work they had done, quiet, impactful, and full of integrity, was enough. They had sparked a revolution, not in headlines, but in hearts. And as long as those hearts continued to beat with compassion, the world would always remember their journey. And as they stood together, watching the world evolve, they knew that the true measure of influence wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet, lasting change they had set in motion. Years passed, and the legacy of Charlie and Keanu's work continued to take root. The world had shifted in ways that no one had quite anticipated when they first embarked on their journey together. The movement they had sparked, the focus on empathy, compassion, and responsible media, had become a new way of engaging with the world. It was a subtle yet profound transformation, one that quietly challenged the norms of both the media industry and society itself. Charlie, now a respected figure in journalistic circles, had found a renewed purpose. He had taken up teaching at a local university, where he guided the next generation of journalists on how to report with integrity, focusing not just on the headlines, but on the humanity behind the stories. His course, titled Journalism with Empathy, became wildly popular, attracting students who wanted to make a difference, not just write about it. He often found himself in deep, meaningful conversations with his students, encouraging them to think critically about the power of their words and the responsibility they carried. "I always tell my students," Charlie once said in an interview, "that journalism isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the most honest. It's about listening first and then telling the stories that matter, not the stories that sell." Keanu, in his own quiet way, had become a force for change in Hollywood. He had never sought fame, but the roles he had chosen, the projects he had supported, had made a significant impact. His decision to take on projects that told stories of human struggle, resilience, and empathy had become a hallmark of his career. Films like The Silent Path and Threads of Humanity not only captivated audiences but also sparked deep discussions about how stories could shape the world. Keanu also took to mentorship, working with young filmmakers and actors to help them find their own voices in the industry. "Film has the power to change hearts," he often said, "but only if we're willing to speak the truth, even when it's difficult." Together, they had seen a quiet revolution unfold, a shift in how stories were told and how people listened. They had proven that change didn't always have to be loud to be powerful. It could be slow, deliberate, and most importantly, it could be rooted in compassion. But as the years went by, both Charlie and Keanu began to realize that their work was far from finished. The world they had helped shape was still in flux. While empathy had taken root in many places, there was still a long way to go before it could fully change the media landscape. They knew that their journey would always be ongoing, that their message would need to be continually reaffirmed. One day, Charlie received a letter that changed everything. It was from the family of a young journalist named Eva, who had been a student in one of Charlie's earlier classes. She had passed away unexpectedly while reporting in a war zone. But the letter she had left behind was filled with gratitude for the lessons Charlie had taught her. In her letter, Eva wrote, "I know that I'm just one voice in a sea of others, but I hope my work will matter. I hope that when I write, I am not just telling the story of conflict, but the story of humanity within it. You taught me that journalism is not about sensationalism. It's about understanding. It's about compassion. It's about making sure that the voices of the unheard are given space to speak." The letter struck Charlie deeply. It was a reminder that the work they had done was still having an impact, that their message had been passed on to others who would continue it long after they were gone. Keanu, too, was moved by the letter, but in his typical quiet way, he said little. He knew that the true impact of their journey wasn't in the accolades or recognition they had received, but in the lives they had touched along the way. Eva's letter was proof that their influence was not just in the people who followed them, but in the lives of those who had gone on to influence others. As the years went on, Keanu and Charlie remained in touch, meeting regularly to reflect on their journey. They had traveled the world, seen the struggles and triumphs of countless people, and had learned more than they ever thought possible. Yet, they knew that their work would never truly be done. There were still stories to be told, lessons to be learned, and bridges to be built. One evening, as they sat on the porch of a small house in the countryside, watching the sunset, Charlie looked over at Keanu and smiled. "You know, I never thought it would come to this," he said softly. "We've come so far from that day when you stepped up to the podium and called for change. I think we've built something real, something that has outlasted even our expectations." Keanu, as always, smiled faintly, his gaze focused on the horizon. "I think we've done what we needed to do," he replied. "We sparked something in others. We lit the fire. Now it's up to them to keep it going." And as they sat there, both men knew that the world they had helped create was one they would never fully leave. The work they had started had taken on a life of its own, evolving in ways they couldn't have imagined. But the core of it, the message of empathy, compassion, and the quiet power of listening, was enduring. It was a message that would continue to grow, one that would echo through the generations to come. And as long as people remembered to listen, to see the humanity in others, the world would continue to change for the better. Charlie and Keanu, though no longer at the center of the spotlight, had given the world something much more lasting than fame or fortune. They had given it a new way of understanding, a new way of connecting, and a new way of being. And in the quiet moments of reflection, they both knew that their work had never been about seeking recognition. It had always been about creating something far more meaningful, a legacy that would continue long after the headlines faded. The world, changed by the silent revolution they had started, moved forward. As the years stretched on, the movement that Charlie and Keanu had ignited grew into something larger than either of them had initially envisioned. Though they had retreated from the public eye, the foundation they had laid was still strong. The world, particularly the younger generation, continued to build upon the principles of empathy, kindness, and authenticity. Yet, despite the many positive changes, the challenges that had once plagued society had not disappeared. There were still divisions, still people who refused to listen, still an industry that often preferred sensation over truth. As the world shifted, Charlie and Keanu's influence, though quieter, still loomed in the background. They often received letters, messages, and emails from people who had been inspired by their work, those who had taken the lessons they taught and applied them in their own lives. There was a constant thread running through all these messages, a yearning for real, lasting change. People were hungry for something more than the endless noise of media and politics. They wanted hope, they wanted connection, and they wanted to see that the change they so deeply desired was possible. One morning, as Charlie sat in his study reading through some of the messages, he paused on one letter that caught his attention. It was from a young journalist, Olivia, who had recently lost her job at a major news outlet. She wrote, "I used to be like you, Charlie. I thought the louder I was, the more people would listen. I thought I needed to create chaos to make a name for myself. But after losing my job and reflecting on what really mattered, I realized I was doing it all wrong. I want to make a difference, not just stir up controversy. I want to tell the stories that need to be told, but with integrity and humanity. How can I make this change in an industry that rewards the opposite?" The letter struck a chord with Charlie. It was a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. He had always believed that the power of the media could be used for good, but that power had often been diluted by the industry's focus on clickbait and sensationalism. Olivia's message was a call to action, one that he couldn't ignore. Charlie spent several days reflecting on Olivia's words, contemplating how he could help guide a new generation of journalists and media professionals who were committed to changing the industry from within. He had spent years teaching at the university, but there was something more urgent now, something more global that he could not ignore. His message needed to reach further, to create a true revolution in journalism. Meanwhile, Keanu was quietly following a similar path of reflection. While he had distanced himself from the Hollywood spotlight, he still felt the weight of the impact he had made through his films, his mentorship, and the lessons he had imparted to so many young actors and filmmakers. But he too was aware of the deep challenges still facing society. He knew that his work as an actor, though powerful, was only one piece of a larger puzzle. There was still much to be done to address the systemic issues that perpetuated inequality, injustice, and division. One evening, while on a trip to New York, Keanu attended a small gathering of activists, journalists, and philanthropists. The conversation that night was centered around the theme of changing the narrative, how the stories we tell ourselves shape the world we live in. Keanu found himself reflecting deeply on the idea. He realized that his message had always been about showing compassion in the face of adversity, but what if the change needed to go even deeper? What if the media, the very tool that shaped people's perceptions of reality, could be used to create a new narrative, one where empathy, connection, and understanding were at the core? The more Keanu thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't be a passive observer anymore. He had to act. The stories that the world was consuming were still filled with division and fear. He knew he could do more than just advocate for change. He could help create the change by directly contributing to the way those stories were told. It didn't take long for both men to realize that their paths were converging once again. They both shared a desire to do something bigger, something more immediate than they had done before. They had already changed the world in quiet ways, but now they wanted to be part of a bold new chapter. One afternoon, they sat down together at Charlie's home in the countryside, both aware that the time had come for them to act once again. As they discussed the future, Charlie spoke first. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his tone thoughtful. "The world is ready for a real shift, Keanu. The younger generation, people like Olivia, they're desperate for guidance. They want to make change, but they're facing the same challenges we did, and then some. The media landscape is still dominated by clickbait and negativity, and it's discouraging. We've made progress, but we can't stop now." Keanu nodded, his expression calm. "I agree. I've been feeling the same way. We've seen what can happen when we work from the inside out, but there's more to do. If we really want to change things, we need to challenge the status quo head-on. We can't keep waiting for others to lead the way." Charlie's eyes sparkled with a new sense of determination. "So, what if we start a new initiative? Something that directly engages with journalists, filmmakers, and content creators. A movement that helps them understand the power they have to create stories that matter. We can offer mentorship, resources, and a platform for those who want to make a difference but don't know where to begin." Keanu's lips curled into a faint smile. "I love that idea. We've been talking about it for years, Charlie. Maybe it's time to actually build it." The idea for a new initiative, which they named the Narrative Project, began to take shape. It would be a platform that connected media professionals, journalists, filmmakers, writers, and content creators with resources, education, and a community of like-minded individuals who were committed to telling stories that mattered. The goal was not just to create a space for alternative narratives, but to empower those in the industry to reshape how stories were told. Through the Narrative Project, Charlie and Keanu hoped to offer workshops, mentorship programs, and a network of support for individuals who wanted to use their craft to influence the world positively. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The media industry, after all, was still driven by algorithms and sensationalism. But they also knew that change had to start somewhere, and if they could provide the tools and guidance to those who were willing to fight for it, they would start to see the transformation they had always dreamed of. As the initiative began to take form, they started to receive an overwhelming response from people around the world. Journalists from small, independent outlets, filmmakers working on socially conscious projects, and even young people just starting in their careers all expressed their interest in being a part of the Narrative Project. It was clear that Charlie and Keanu had sparked something once again. The world was ready for a shift, one that went beyond surface-level change and dug deep into the core of how stories were shaped. But as they moved forward with this new endeavor, Charlie and Keanu knew the road would be long. They had taken on a responsibility that was far larger than either of them had originally anticipated. But the fire was burning once again, and this time, they weren't just standing on the sidelines. They were part of something that had the potential to reshape the very fabric of the world's storytelling. With a renewed sense of purpose, they stood together at the helm of the Narrative Project, ready to guide the next generation of media professionals toward a future of compassion, truth, and understanding. The next chapter was about to begin, and this time, the world would be listening. As the Narrative Project took off, Charlie and Keanu found themselves immersed in a whirlwind of activity. They spent countless hours organizing workshops, meeting with emerging filmmakers and journalists, and helping to build a platform that would serve as a sanctuary for those who believed in telling stories that mattered. The initiative quickly gained momentum, attracting a diverse group of individuals from all corners of the world. Those who were tired of the clickbait culture and the endless cycle of sensationalism, and who longed for a more authentic, compassionate approach to media. The first few months were filled with excitement, optimism, and the kind of collaborative energy that made it clear they were on the right path. Charlie was in his element, teaching new generations of journalists how to balance their passion for storytelling with the integrity that was often missing from mainstream media. Keanu, on the other hand, lent his voice and wisdom to workshops on film and storytelling, helping young filmmakers understand the importance of creating narratives that not only entertained but also inspired change. Despite the early successes, the pair couldn't ignore the undercurrents of resistance. As the Narrative Project gained visibility, it caught the attention of the very industries they were seeking to challenge. Traditional media outlets, wary of the shift in narrative, began to push back. Corporate sponsors of popular news channels began to question the viability of supporting a movement that prioritized human connection over profit margins. But Charlie and Keanu were resolute. They had seen the power of empathy in action, and they knew it could not be extinguished, no matter how hard the system tried to resist. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charlie and Keanu sat on the porch of Keanu's modest cabin in the mountains, reflecting on how far they had come. "We've made a real difference," Charlie said, his voice a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "I've seen so many incredible stories come out of this project already. Stories of people overcoming adversity, journalists speaking out about the pressure to sensationalize, filmmakers creating projects with integrity. But I can feel the pushback coming." Keanu nodded, his eyes steady as he looked out at the sprawling forest. "The system doesn't like change. We knew that going in. The real question is, how do we keep pushing forward without losing what we've built?" Charlie sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's the struggle, isn't it? We can't afford to compromise. We've got to stick to the values that have brought us here. Honesty, empathy, connection. But it's tough. The world moves so fast, and it's easy for things to get co-opted or twisted. Keanu's expression softened as he turned to face his friend. But that's where the real power is, Charlie. In staying true to ourselves. If we compromise now, we risk becoming what we fought against. We need to remember that the stories we tell are bigger than the platforms that broadcast them. The conversation lingered in the air, and though neither man had a definitive answer, both felt a deep sense of purpose. They were at the forefront of a battle, one that wasn't going to be won overnight. Yet, in that quiet moment of reflection, they both understood the most crucial thing of all. They had to remain steadfast. Their commitment to authenticity was what had set them apart in the first place, and it was the same commitment that would drive the movement forward. Over the following months, the Narrative Project grew from a small initiative into a global network. Journalists, filmmakers, and content creators came together, sharing their stories and inspiring each other to stay true to their values. Through the platform, they collaborated on projects that highlighted untold stories, issues of injustice, and the quiet triumphs of everyday people. Each story became a ripple, spreading out into the world, challenging the status quo, and demanding a new kind of media, one rooted in empathy and truth. But even as the network flourished, Charlie and Keanu knew that they could not rest. The industry was evolving rapidly, and new challenges constantly arose. The very platform they had built was now being scrutinized by those who saw it as a threat to their dominance. News outlets that thrived on sensationalism began to label the Narrative Project as too soft or too idealistic, while critics questioned the sustainability of a movement that didn't prioritize profitability. Despite the criticisms, the Narrative Project continued to thrive, but it was clear that they needed to evolve and adapt to ensure its survival. It was around this time that a pivotal opportunity presented itself, a chance to collaborate with a major media conglomerate that, on the surface, appeared to share their values. The conglomerate had recently announced a new initiative to highlight stories that focused on kindness, social justice, and positive change. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to reach a wider audience and amplify the movement's message. But Charlie and Keanu were cautious. They had seen firsthand how easily their message could be co-opted, diluted, or twisted for commercial gain. The potential collaboration was tempting, but it came with strings attached: corporate demands, brand requirements, and a promise of higher exposure in exchange for compromising on certain core values. It was a delicate balance. After weeks of deliberation, they called a meeting with the leadership of the Narrative Project to discuss the proposal. Sitting in the conference room with their closest allies, journalists, filmmakers, and community leaders, Charlie and Keanu laid out the options on the table. "I'm not sure about this," Charlie said, his brow furrowed. "On one hand, this could be the breakthrough we need to get our message out to millions. But on the other hand, I can already feel the pressure to water things down, to make it palatable for mainstream audiences. This isn't why we started this." Keanu nodded, his calm demeanor masking the uncertainty he felt. "We've always said that our message needs to stay authentic. But what happens when the world catches up to us? Do we pull away, or do we find a way to adapt without compromising?" There was a heavy silence as everyone at the table weighed in. Each person had a different perspective, but one thing was clear: there was no easy answer. This moment would determine not just the future of the Narrative Project, but the direction of the entire movement. Charlie and Keanu decided to take the time they needed to make their decision, reaching out to trusted friends and mentors for guidance. After much thought, they realized that the Narrative Project wasn't just about making a name for themselves or gaining recognition. It was about empowering others, individuals, communities, and organizations, to tell their stories regardless of the platform. They chose to decline the offer from the media conglomerate, standing firm in their belief that the movement had to remain independent. Instead, they would continue to build relationships with like-minded organizations and individuals who shared their vision, expanding the reach of the Narrative Project without compromising its integrity. It was a bold decision, one that left them feeling both relieved and uncertain. But as they looked at the faces around them, those who had been with them from the beginning, they knew they had made the right choice. They had built something real, something that was grounded in trust, authenticity, and compassion. And, as the movement continued to grow, Charlie and Keanu remained unwavering in their commitment to telling the stories that truly mattered, knowing that the seeds of change they had planted would one day bear fruit, quietly but powerfully. Though the road ahead would be filled with challenges, one thing was certain. Charlie and Keanu had created a movement that was built to last. They had ignited a revolution, not in headlines or viral moments, but in the hearts of those who believed in the power of storytelling to change the world. And that, in the end, was the most powerful legacy they could leave behind. As the momentum behind the narrative project continued to grow, Charlie and Keanu's initiative began to take on a life of its own. The platform, once a small, idealistic dream, had now become a beacon for a new era of storytelling, one that prioritized truth, compassion, and authenticity over sensationalism. Yet, even as their message resonated with an ever-expanding community of journalists, filmmakers, and content creators, the pressure to scale and evolve was mounting. They had chosen the road less traveled, but it was becoming clear that the challenges they faced were growing more complex with every step. Despite the early resistance from the established media industry, something unexpected began to happen. A growing wave of young creators, disillusioned by the shallow sensationalism they had been raised with, began to gravitate toward the narrative project. Their voices echoed through the platform, offering new perspectives, daring to challenge the entrenched norms. But as the movement gained more influence, the resistance from corporate media began to intensify. It wasn't long before mainstream outlets began to take a closer look at the narrative project, both intrigued by its rise and threatened by its message. A growing number of traditional news organizations, whose revenues had long relied on shock value, sensationalist headlines, and divisive narratives, began to feel the heat of their failing model. Advertisers were no longer seeing the same returns from their old methods, and the steady influx of new voices advocating for a more compassionate approach to storytelling was making a dent. One day, while preparing for an important press conference, Charlie received an unexpected email from an influential media mogul, Victor Davenport. The subject line simply read, "A proposal for collaboration." Charlie read the email with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Davenport was known for his vast empire in the media world, a man who had built his fortune on manipulating public opinion, capitalizing on the human penchant for conflict. His empire had profited greatly from the cycle of division, fear, and outrage. The email invited Charlie to a private meeting, offering to discuss a potential collaboration between the narrative project and Davenport's conglomerate. Davenport was intrigued by the growing success of the narrative project and saw an opportunity to merge his vast platform with the integrity that Charlie's initiative represented. The email included a subtle but clear proposition: join forces, and they could amplify their reach to unprecedented levels. Charlie felt a tightening in his chest as he read the message again. It was the same dilemma they had faced before, the possibility of massive exposure, but at the cost of compromise. Davenport's offer would mean the narrative project could reach millions more, but the price would be the same. Their values, their message, and the very foundation of what they had worked so hard to build. The meeting with Victor Davenport took place in a sleek, modern office high above the city. Davenport, dressed in a tailored suit, greeted Charlie with a warm handshake and a confident smile. He had a commanding presence, his wealth and power reflected in the polished lines of the room and the subtle luxury that exuded from every corner. "Charlie, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," Davenport said, his voice smooth and measured. "I've been following the narrative project for some time now, and I must say, I'm impressed. The movement you've started has captured the imagination of many, and I believe we have an opportunity here to do something remarkable together." Charlie sat across from him, aware of the tension in the room. He knew exactly what Davenport was getting at. "I'm listening," Charlie replied, his voice steady but cautious. Davenport leaned forward slightly, a glint of ambition in his eyes. "We have a platform that reaches millions, Charlie. Imagine the impact you could have if we merge your message with our reach. We could turn the narrative project into something global. Think of the stories you could amplify. Think of the change we could create together." Charlie studied him closely. Davenport wasn't interested in what the narrative project had stood for. He was interested in its potential for profit. His media empire thrived on control, and merging with an independent initiative like theirs would give him even more leverage. "I'm not here to make a deal just for the sake of exposure," Charlie said, his voice calm but firm. What we've built is more than just a platform for change. It's about integrity. It's about keeping the stories we tell authentic and true. Davenport chuckled softly, as though he had heard it all before. Integrity is important, of course, but let's not kid ourselves, Charlie. At the end of the day, it's about reach. It's about influence. We both know that's how change happens. Look at the power of mainstream media. Imagine what we could accomplish if we worked together. Charlie paused, his mind racing. He had seen the way mainstream media had twisted and manipulated stories for profit. Could they really afford to hand over control to someone like Davenport, even if it meant greater exposure? Was it worth the risk? The answer was clear. The Narrative Project had to remain true to its roots. Its purpose wasn't to become just another cog in the media machine. It was about creating a space where stories could be told with respect, with humanity, and with the belief that every voice mattered. I appreciate the offer, Victor, Charlie said, standing up, but we've built something real here, and I'm not willing to compromise it for profit. We'll keep fighting, and we'll keep growing, but we're going to do it on our terms. Davenport's smile faded slightly, but he masked it with a quick nod. I respect your decision, Charlie, but don't say I didn't warn you. The world won't wait forever. Charlie left the meeting with a mixture of relief and resolve. He knew they had made the right choice, but the stakes were getting higher. As the Narrative Project continued to challenge the established order, it was clear that they were not just battling for a place in the media landscape. They were fighting for the future of storytelling itself. Back at the headquarters of the Narrative Project, Charlie and Keanu discussed the meeting late into the evening. Keanu, as always, was thoughtful in his response. You did the right thing, Charlie, Keanu said. We've always known that true change doesn't come from aligning with the status quo. It comes from building something that challenges it. Charlie nodded, though a weight still hung over him. But the pressure is growing. The media giants, the corporations, they don't want this to succeed. They're threatened by it. That's why it will succeed, Keanu replied with a quiet smile. The world needs more truth, more stories that matter. And we're not going to stop until we've reached as many people as possible. As the weeks passed, the Narrative Project continued to expand, growing not only in size but in influence. Their refusal to compromise had only made their message more powerful. People across the world began to see the value in authenticity, in stories that didn't try to sensationalize, in narratives that sought to connect rather than divide. The battle for control of the narrative was far from over. But Charlie and Keanu had made their stand, and with it, they had proven that the fight for truth and empathy in storytelling was one worth waging. No matter the challenges they faced, they were ready to continue their journey, knowing that the seeds of change they had planted would eventually bear fruit, quiet but undeniable, in every corner of the world. The tipping point had come, and the Narrative Project was no longer just a movement, it was a force. Months passed, and the Narrative Project began to settle into its role as a new kind of media platform, one that celebrated voices that had long been marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. Its growth was fueled not by corporate dollars, but by an organic community of creators who understood that storytelling, when done with empathy, could change the course of history. These were the stories of refugees, activists, communities struggling against systemic oppression, and individuals finding strength in adversity. Each narrative shared on the platform wasn't just a story. It was a statement of defiance against the status quo. Charlie and Keanu had often discussed how to ensure the platform never lost its way, and both knew that they had to protect it from the very commercialization they had once turned down. The problem was, the world was changing rapidly, and as their project grew, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the purity of their mission without sacrificing some level of attention and financial support. But as long as they kept their community in the forefront, they believed the Narrative Project could remain true to its roots. One afternoon, as Charlie was reviewing the latest submissions for an upcoming anthology on systemic injustice, he received a message that made his heart skip. It was from Nadia, one of the journalists who had been integral in the early days of the project. Nadia was a former war correspondent who had joined the movement after years of covering violence and corruption. Her commitment to truth and justice had made her an invaluable member of their team. The message was brief, but the urgency in her words couldn't be ignored. Charlie, we've got a major story on our hands. I need your help. This is bigger than anything we've done before. Please call me as soon as you can." Without hesitation, Charlie dialed Nadia's number. When she picked up, her voice was steady but filled with an unmistakable tension. "I'm listening," Charlie said, trying to mask the anxiety creeping in. "Listen carefully," Nadia began. "I've been investigating a massive scandal involving the pharmaceutical industry. The extent of corruption is staggering. It's not just about big money, Charlie. This is about lives. People are being exploited, manipulated, and kept in the dark. The truth is being buried, and I've got evidence that can blow the lid off it." Charlie's heart raced. "I knew you were working on something big, but this sounds dangerous. Are you sure about this?" "I've seen enough to know it's all connected," Nadia replied. "The media, the politicians, the corporations, they're all involved. And I'm not the only one who's been digging into this. There are whistleblowers, insiders who've come forward, and we have proof of what's been going on behind closed doors. But it's bigger than just publishing a story. We need to take it to the people, Charlie. This is the kind of truth we're fighting for." Charlie's mind raced. This wasn't just a typical investigative piece. This was explosive, potentially world-changing information. Information that could take down powerful figures who had long held dominion over global media narratives. But with that kind of power came unimaginable risk. He took a deep breath. "All right, I'm in. But we need to be careful. We can't do this alone. We'll need to bring in legal support, security, whatever it takes to protect everyone involved." "We've got it covered," Nadia assured him. "But we'll need your platform, Charlie. We need the narrative project to be the home for this story." As the investigation unfolded, Charlie and Keanu worked closely with Nadia and a growing team of journalists, legal experts, and digital security specialists to ensure the truth would come to light. They navigated the complexities of protecting anonymous sources, ensuring that the story's integrity remained intact while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable backlash that would follow. Keanu, who had always approached media with an artistic lens, now found himself assisting with the visual representation of the project. His experience in film gave him the tools to bring the investigation to life in a way that would resonate on a deep, emotional level with the audience. Together, they crafted a compelling multimedia experience that combined articles, videos, interviews, and social media content, each piece carefully designed to both inform and engage. The moment they published the first of many investigative pieces on the narrative project, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded, debates raged, and mainstream outlets scrambled to respond. But there was something different this time. The narrative project had managed to bring together a network of independent journalists, filmmakers, and creators who were willing to risk everything to amplify the story. Despite the vast power and wealth of the corporations at the heart of the scandal, the collective power of the platform's community couldn't be ignored. Whistleblowers came forward in droves, sharing their own experiences and corroborating the findings that Nadia had painstakingly gathered. It became clear that this was not just one isolated incident. It was part of a larger systemic issue, one that had been going on for decades. And then came the pushback. In a shocking move, a powerful conglomerate that owned several news outlets attempted to discredit the narrative project by launching a smear campaign. They called the investigative series a conspiracy theory, smoke and mirrors distraction, designed to undermine public trust. They tried to create doubt in the minds of the public, using their immense reach to flood the airwaves with counter-narratives that painted the whistleblowers as unreliable, even dangerous. But this time, something was different. The very people who had been silenced for so long were now speaking up, loudly, confidently, and together. As the media giants tried to discredit the investigation, the public's faith in mainstream outlets began to erode. The more they attempted to shut it down, the more people rallied behind the narrative project. Charlie and Keanu knew they were on the verge of a historic moment. They had set the stage for a paradigm shift, a world where power wasn't just controlled by a few, but shared by the many. And as the weeks wore on, it became clear that they weren't just fighting for the truth. They were fighting for the future of journalism itself. During a particularly intense meeting, Charlie and Keanu gathered the entire team in the conference room to discuss next steps. They knew they were in dangerous territory, and the risk of retaliation was growing by the day. but the stakes were too high to back down. "We have to keep pushing," Charlie said, his voice filled with conviction. "We can't let them silence us. We have the truth on our side, and we have the people on our side. It's time to turn up the heat." Keanu nodded, his normally calm demeanor now charged with purpose. "This isn't just about exposing corruption. It's about showing the world that we don't have to be afraid to speak out. We have the power to change the narrative." As they set their strategy in motion, Charlie felt a surge of hope. This was it, the moment they had been working for. The narrative project wasn't just a platform. It was a revolution in storytelling, and it was gaining momentum. Days later, a public announcement was made, an unprecedented one. The narrative project would not just continue its investigation into the pharmaceutical industry. It would expand its mission to take on the systemic issues that had allowed such corruption to thrive in the first place. They would create a global platform dedicated to exposing corruption, advocating for social justice, and empowering those whose voices had been ignored for too long. It was a declaration of war against the very systems that had kept the truth locked behind a wall of lies. But Charlie and Keanu weren't afraid. The future of storytelling was in their hands, and they knew that this was only the beginning. As they moved forward, they weren't just rewriting the narrative, they were changing the world. The seismic waves of the narrative project's investigation continued to reverberate across the globe. News outlets, once focused on entertainment-driven clickbait, now found themselves struggling to keep up with the raw power of grassroots journalism. The public, increasingly aware of the deception that had permeated their media consumption for years, began to demand more. They wanted truth. They wanted stories that mattered. They wanted transparency. Charlie and Keanu, alongside Nadia and their expanding team, now found themselves at the center of a whirlwind. The investigation had sparked a cultural awakening. Ordinary citizens were rallying to their cause, sharing their own stories, demanding accountability from both governments and corporations. The very thing that had once seemed like an impossible dream, authentic storytelling that resonated with real people, was now becoming a movement. But with this wave of support came new challenges. The establishment wasn't going to back down quietly. Powerful interests that had controlled the narrative for so long weren't about to lose their grip without a fight. One evening, as Charlie sat in his office, reflecting on the whirlwind of activity, Keanu walked in, his face tight with concern. "Charlie, we need to talk," Keanu said, closing the door behind him. "There's something happening. Something bigger than just media backlash." Charlie looked up from his desk. "What do you mean?" Keanu took a seat across from him, his eyes searching. "It's not just the media anymore. We're being targeted. I've heard whispers from several sources. There are entities with deep pockets, ones that want to shut us down, by any means necessary." Charlie felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by any means necessary?" Keanu paused, then spoke gravely. "I've been approached by people I didn't know were watching us. They're trying to buy our silence, offer us partnerships, push us in directions that will dilute everything we've worked for." Charlie clenched his fists, his heart racing. This was the moment he had always feared. The moment when they'd have to face the consequences of standing up to the giants. "How serious is this?" "I don't know yet," Keanu replied, his voice low. "But we need to take this seriously. This isn't just about the platform anymore. It's about all of us. We've become a target." Charlie leaned back, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. They had known from the beginning that their pursuit of truth would attract enemies, but they had underestimated the lengths to which those in power would go to preserve their dominance. The narrative project was not just challenging the media. It was challenging the very foundations of the system that had kept so many in the dark for so long. As the pressure mounted, Nadia continued her relentless work on the investigation. She was in constant communication with insiders, cross-referencing documents, verifying testimonies, and following leads that had the potential to bring down entire pharmaceutical empires. But with each new breakthrough, the stakes seemed to grow higher. One morning, Charlie and Nadia met at a small cafe near the office. Nadia, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, slid a manila folder across the table. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We've got it." The smoking gun. Charlie opened the folder carefully. Inside, He found a set of confidential documents, emails, and contracts, damning evidence of a global cover-up involving high-level government officials and major pharmaceutical companies. This was the kind of information that could not be ignored. It was a story too big to bury, one that could forever alter the course of history. Charlie looked at Nadia, his heart pounding. This could bring them all down. Nadia nodded gravely. It will. But we need to move quickly. The people behind this are ruthless, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way. Back at the Narrative Project headquarters, the team went into overdrive. They knew they had a limited window of time to release the information before the opposition made a move. Keanu worked tirelessly, helping create a series of powerful visuals and multimedia presentations that would accompany the written pieces. The strategy was clear. They needed to build the narrative so compellingly that no one could ignore it. The night before the official release, Charlie stood in front of a mirror in his office, staring at his reflection. He had always been driven by the belief that storytelling had the power to change the world. But tonight, as the weight of what was about to unfold settled in, he realized that this was no longer just about telling stories. It was about taking a stand, about risking everything for a truth that had been buried for far too long. Just as he was about to leave for the office, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Keanu. "We've got a problem. Meet me in the conference room now." Charlie's stomach sank. He knew that this was the moment. Whatever was about to happen would determine the future of the Narrative Project and possibly their own lives. When Charlie entered the conference room, Keanu was there, his face grim. "We've just been hacked," Keanu said, his voice low and urgent. "Everything. Our files, our sources, our communications. It's all been compromised. Someone is watching us." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The forces they had been fighting were now making their move. "Who?" Charlie asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Keanu didn't answer right away. He was busy checking the security system, confirming the breach. Finally, he looked up, his expression hard. "They're professional. This isn't a random attack. Whoever's behind this has the resources to shut us down. They've already started blackmailing our contacts." The next few days were a blur. The Narrative Project team scrambled to implement countermeasures, working with cybersecurity experts to protect their data. Despite their best efforts, it quickly became apparent that they were in over their heads. But they refused to back down. Nadia, Charlie, and Keanu knew that this was the final test. The world needed this story. After days of navigating mounting pressure and threats, the Narrative Project finally released the full investigation to the public. The response was immediate, and it was overwhelming. Social media exploded with shock, outrage, and support. Celebrities, activists, and politicians rallied to the cause, sharing the story with their followers, demanding accountability. But the most powerful moment came when ordinary people, everyday workers, mothers, fathers, students, began speaking out, sharing their personal experiences of being harmed by the system exposed in the investigation. Their voices flooded the platform, providing an unshakable foundation for the truth that had just been revealed. Charlie and Keanu stood at the forefront of it all, knowing that they had crossed a point of no return. They had chosen the path of truth and justice, and now there was no turning back. The ripple effect had begun. The world had woken up, and there was no going back. The days following the release of the Narrative Project's investigation felt like an avalanche of change. Charlie, Keanu, and the rest of the team watched in awe as the story spread across the globe. Every major social media platform was abuzz with conversations about the pharmaceutical corruption scandal. Activists, everyday citizens, and even some mainstream media outlets began to echo the call for transparency and reform. It felt as if the collective consciousness had shifted overnight. But as the world seemed to be waking up, a more dangerous, unseen force was quietly mobilizing behind the scenes. Powerful corporate interests were not going to let their empire crumble without a fight. They had underestimated the reach and impact of the Narrative Project, and now they were determined to shut it down. Their tactics, however, had become more aggressive. Charlie sat at his desk late one evening, scrolling through the dozens of messages, emails, and comments flooding his inbox. It was a mix of support, gratitude, and disbelief. But underneath the positive responses, there was a palpable sense of fear. People were asking if they were safe. The truth, it seemed, had made a lot of people nervous, especially those whose lives depended on the lies they had built. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. He hadn't slept properly in days. Keanu entered the room, his face serious, carrying a stack of documents. "We've got more threats," Keanu said, dropping the files onto the desk. "Some of our team members are getting calls, and others are having their accounts hacked again. It's getting uglier by the day." Charlie looked up at Keanu, his eyes tired but resolute. "What do we do now? We've come this far, and I won't back down. We can't let them silence us." Keanu sighed and sat down, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, but they're trying to tear us apart from the inside. It's not just about the investigation anymore. They're going after our credibility, our team, our very existence. They're pulling out all the stops." Charlie's gaze dropped to the pile of documents Keanu had placed in front of him. Among them were printouts of legal notices, cease and desist letters, and threats of defamation suits. It was clear they were facing an organized campaign meant to dismantle everything they had worked for. "We need to go public with this," Charlie said, a fire igniting in his chest. "If we back down now, they'll win. We've exposed them. Now it's time to expose everything they're doing to try and bury us. We can't let the fear take over." Keanu nodded, his face set in determination. "I'll get on it. But we need to make sure we're protected. There's too much at stake for us to play it safe now." The team went into crisis mode, preparing not only to fight back against the corporate giants, but also to safeguard themselves from potential retaliation. Charlie and Keanu knew they had to take this fight to the public in an even bolder way. They couldn't just share information. They needed to show the world the full extent of the power they were up against. Nadia, who had become a trusted leader within the project, suggested a bold move. "We need to do a live stream, a real-time, unscripted broadcast that tells our side of the story. We need to show people that we're not backing down." Charlie thought about it. "That's risky. If we go live, there's no editing. It could backfire." Nadia's voice was firm. "It's a risk we have to take. We're being attacked from all sides. If we stay quiet, it'll look like we have something to hide. We need to be transparent. We need to show them who we really are and how far we're willing to go for the truth." After a tense silence, Charlie nodded. "Let's do it." The night of the live broadcast arrived, and the atmosphere at the Narrative Project headquarters was charged with tension. The team had prepared for every possible scenario. Technical difficulties, last-minute attacks, anything that could go wrong. But the biggest challenge was the emotional toll this would take. They weren't just revealing the truth, they were revealing themselves. As the countdown clock ticked down, Keanu gave Charlie a quick, reassuring glance. They were in this together, for better or for worse. The live stream began, and the familiar faces of Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia appeared on screen. But there was no polish, no scripted lines, just raw, unfiltered honesty. Charlie spoke first, addressing the audience directly. "We've come this far, and there's no turning back," he began. "We've exposed the truth about an industry that has profited off the suffering of millions. And now, the forces that have been behind this corruption are doing everything they can to silence us. They're attacking our team, spreading lies, and trying to intimidate us into submission." Keanu took over, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "But we won't be silenced. This isn't just about the Narrative Project. This is about all of you. This is about the millions of people who have been hurt by this system, who have been ignored, and who have had their lives destroyed by these corporations. We're not backing down. We need you to stand with us." Nadia's voice cut through, sharp and unwavering. "The truth doesn't stop with us. It's bigger than any one of us. We've had threats. We've had our work stolen. We've had people try to intimidate us. But we are not afraid, and we will never stop fighting for the truth." As they spoke, the comments section exploded. Messages of support flooded in, while others voiced their concerns, their fears, their anger. But there was no turning back now. The public was watching, and they were demanding answers. But just as the broadcast was hitting its peak, something unexpected happened. The feed suddenly cut out. The screen went black. A chilling silence filled the room. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia stared at the screen, their hearts pounding. The hacker had struck again. The blackout lasted for only a few moments, but in those moments, the narrative project was thrust into the spotlight in a way they never anticipated. People on social media, outraged by the interruption, began to demand the return of the broadcast. The hack had only fueled the fire, making the public even more determined to know the truth. Once the feed resumed, Charlie addressed the audience, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the situation. That was no accident. It was an attack on our right to speak the truth. But you know what? We're still here. We're not going anywhere. The next few days were a blur of activity. Legal teams, cybersecurity experts, and journalists worked tirelessly to ensure that the narrative project's message would continue to reach the world. The media giants, whose interests were threatened by the project's revelations, were now using every tool at their disposal to discredit the team, but the support from the public was overwhelming. The tipping point had come, the truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the bottle. In the days following the broadcast, a wave of solidarity swept through the media landscape. Independent journalists, politicians, and even celebrities rallied behind the narrative project. The hack had backfired. It had only galvanized the movement. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia watched as the movement they had started began to take on a life of its own. But the war wasn't over. As they dug deeper, more revelations came to light, and the powers that had once been untouchable now found themselves on the defensive. It was clear. The narrative was shifting, and as they moved forward, Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia knew one thing for certain. They would never stop fighting for the truth. Because now, more than ever, the truth was their most powerful weapon. The momentum from the live broadcast had taken on a life of its own. People from all walks of life, ordinary citizens, whistleblowers, celebrities, were now rallying behind the narrative project. But with every victory came a new threat. The powers that be were not just watching from the sidelines. They were reacting, and their counterattack was swift and devastating. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia could feel the tension mounting. Their phones rang incessantly, messages flooding in with news of threats to their team, new attempts to undermine their credibility, and even whispers of corporate retaliation. The world had heard their story, and now the corporations and governments they had exposed were circling like sharks, ready to strike. Late one evening, as Charlie and Keanu sat in the office going over their next move, Nadia burst in, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. Keanu took the phone and scrolled through the latest news. His expression darkened as he read the headlines. Charlie Walker and Keanu Reeves accused of fabricating major pharmaceutical scandal. The article, published by a well-known corporate-backed news outlet, was a full-scale attack on their credibility. It was packed with slanderous claims, dubious sources, and conveniently leaked information that painted them as opportunistic journalists willing to manufacture a story for the sake of fame and money. Their personal lives were scrutinized, their relationships twisted, and even Keanu's charitable endeavors were misrepresented as attempts to cover up personal wrongdoing. Charlie clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. He had known that something like this was coming. They were making it clear. The narrative project had become a target, not just because they were exposing the truth, but because they were now a threat to the status quo. "They're trying to discredit us," Charlie said, his voice laced with frustration. "But they won't get away with this." Keanu's expression was grim. "They're trying to turn the public against us. It's not just about us anymore. This is about shutting down everything we stand for." Nadia looked at them both, her eyes filled with resolve. "Then we fight back. We don't just let them drag us through the mud. We expose this for what it is, an attack on the truth." Over the next few days, the team worked around the clock to counter the narrative that was being spun against them. They knew they had to hit back hard, not just with facts, but with undeniable proof. They dug into the claims being made against them, uncovering the web of connections between the media outlet behind the attack and the corporations they had been investigating. It didn't take long for the team to uncover something shocking. The leaked documents that had been used to discredit them were, in fact, part of an orchestrated smear campaign. A handful of high-level corporate operatives had planted false information in an attempt to frame them as frauds. But they had left a trail. a digital breadcrumb that led directly back to the very people they had been investigating. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia knew they had their smoking gun. They now had concrete proof of the malicious campaign to destroy them. "It's time to turn the tables," Charlie said, a fierce determination in his eyes. "We're going to expose them for what they really are." The team worked tirelessly to build their counter-report. This time, it wasn't just about reporting facts. It was about taking down the system that had tried to bury the truth. They compiled emails, call logs, and insider information that linked the smear campaign directly to the corporations involved in the pharmaceutical scandal. They didn't just have a story, they had evidence that was irrefutable. On the day the counter-report was scheduled to go live, the atmosphere in the office was electric. Every member of the team knew the stakes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ensuring that the truth prevailed. Keanu paced the office, his face tense. "Once we go live, there's no going back. They'll come after us harder than ever." Nadia, who had been coordinating with their cybersecurity team, nodded. "We're ready. We've built layers of security, and we've got backup plans in place. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been lied to for years." Charlie stood in front of the team, his gaze unwavering. "We've made a difference already. This report will show the world exactly what's at stake. They can try to silence us, but they can't silence the truth." When the report was released, it hit like a storm. The evidence they presented was undeniable. The corporate interests behind the smear campaign were exposed for what they were: manipulators of the truth, willing to do anything to maintain their grip on power. The digital footprints they had left behind were a glaring testament to their dishonesty and deceit. Within hours, the public response was overwhelming. Social media exploded with support, and journalists across the world began picking up the story. The corporate-backed news outlet that had tried to tear them down was forced into damage control mode, attempting to spin the story in their favor, but it was too late. The truth had already taken hold. As Charlie watched the responses pour in, comments, shares, articles from independent outlets, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had done it. They had not only defended themselves, but they had exposed the very system that had tried to crush them. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The weeks that followed were a blur of media interviews, public appearances, and speaking engagements. The narrative project had gained global recognition, but it had also gained enemies, powerful, dangerous enemies. The forces they had been fighting against were still working behind the scenes, scrambling to maintain control, using every trick in the book to undermine the momentum Charlie and his team had built. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia knew that they couldn't rest on their laurels. Every victory was met with new threats. But they had come too far to stop now. The movement they had started was no longer just about the pharmaceutical scandal. It had become a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been lied to, silenced, or ignored. And as they prepared for what was next, they knew one thing for certain. The fight for the truth had only just begun. One night, as Charlie and Keanu stood on the balcony of their office, looking out over the city, Keanu turned to Charlie, his voice soft but steady. "You know, we've made a lot of enemies, but we've also made a lot of allies. We're not alone in this anymore." Charlie nodded, taking a deep breath. "No, we're not. And that's what gives me hope. We're part of something bigger now. It's a movement, and we're just getting started." As they stood in the quiet, looking out at the city that had been both their battleground and their inspiration, they knew that no matter how hard the fight got, they would never stop. Because they had learned one undeniable truth. The fight for the truth was the most important fight they would ever face. And they were ready for whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia found themselves entrenched in a battle far bigger than any of them had ever imagined. The narrative project had grown into a global movement, a symbol of transparency, justice, and the fight for truth. But with this newfound power came new, darker threats, threats that reached into every corner of their lives. Every time they thought they had gained the upper hand, the corporations they had exposed retaliated with greater ferocity. Cyber attacks, smear campaigns, and legal threats became a constant presence. There were moments of doubt, of fear. But through it all, they never wavered in their mission. Now, however, they were facing something even more sinister. It started with a quiet phone call. Charlie had just finished a late-night interview when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Walker," a low voice said, "you've done a lot of damage, but now it's time to end this." Before Charlie could respond, the line went dead. The feeling of unease that had been building inside him suddenly solidified into something far more real. This wasn't just an empty threat. It felt personal. They weren't just trying to discredit them anymore. They were trying to eliminate them. Charlie's hands trembled as he set the phone down. He glanced over at Keanu, who had been listening from across the room. Keanu's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "What was that?" Keanu asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "It's getting worse," Charlie replied, his voice low. "They're not playing around anymore." Nadia, who had been working late herself, walked into the room, her face pinched with concern. "What's going on?" Charlie told them about the call, and for the first time in a long while, the team felt a sense of vulnerability. They had been used to fighting the system, but this was something different. It was no longer just about exposing corruption, it was about survival. "We need to take this to the next level," Nadia said, her eyes fierce. "We need to go to the authorities. We need to make sure they know what we're dealing with." Keanu nodded. "But we also need to be ready for whatever's coming. This isn't just about us anymore. If they go after us, they're going after everyone who believes in the truth." The team spent the next few days in a heightened state of alert. They doubled down on security, made arrangements for their personal safety, and reached out to trusted allies in law enforcement and journalism. But as much as they tried to prepare, they knew that the shadow hanging over them was growing darker. Then came the ultimatum. A formal letter arrived at their office, a chilling, carefully worded demand. The message was clear: stop your work or face the consequences. The letter was signed by one of the largest pharmaceutical conglomerates in the world, an entity that had managed to avoid scrutiny for decades. The consequences mentioned were vague but threatening, and the letter left no room for negotiation. Charlie felt his stomach drop as he read through it. They had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. They were now fully aware of the stakes, and they were higher than they had ever imagined. "This is it," Charlie said, his voice tight. "They're trying to scare us into quitting." Keanu's jaw clenched. "It's not going to work. We're not stopping." Nadia stepped forward, determination in her eyes. "But we can't ignore the gravity of this. They won't hesitate to hurt us if they think it will stop the truth from coming out." Charlie paused for a moment, then made a decision. "We go public with the letter. We make this bigger than just our fight. We bring the world into it." The team wasted no time. The following morning, a live broadcast was scheduled, where they would not only reveal the letter but also explain the gravity of the situation. The goal was simple: to put the powers that be on notice. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the people who believed in what they were doing, for every individual who had been wronged by the system. The broadcast began, and Charlie's voice was calm but filled with purpose. "The time has come for us to show you exactly how far the corruption goes," he began. "For months, we've been investigating the link between powerful pharmaceutical companies and the suppression of critical health data. We've exposed their lies, their cover-ups, and the people they've harmed in the process. But today, we're revealing something even darker." Charlie then held up the letter for the camera to see, the corporate logo emblazoned on the paper. "This letter is a direct threat against us, a demand to stop exposing the truth. But we won't be intimidated. We're not backing down, and we will never stop fighting for the truth." The feed was flooded with comments and shares within seconds. As the team spoke, the world seemed to hold its breath. The power dynamics had shifted. It wasn't just about one group of journalists anymore. It was about the collective will of the public to see change, no matter the cost. Within hours of the broadcast, a wave of outrage spread across social media. Activists, politicians, and celebrities rallied behind the narrative project, condemning the pharmaceutical giants for their blatant attempts to suppress the truth. But with this wave of support came a counterattack that was far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The team received a series of anonymous, cryptic messages warning them that their families would be targeted if they didn't comply with the demands. The threats weren't vague this time. There was a direct implication of harm, physical harm, that sent a cold shiver down their spines. Charlie sat in the office, his phone in hand, staring at the messages. His heart raced as he tried to formulate a plan. They had come so far, but now they were facing an enemy willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. "We can't let them hurt anyone," Charlie said, his voice tight with emotion. "Not our families, not our team." Keanu stood up, his posture firm. "We've come too far to stop now. This is the moment we've been preparing for. They want to destroy us, but we have the truth on our side. And the truth is stronger than any threat they can make." Nadia nodded. "We fight back. We don't back down." The next few days were a blur of activity. With the world watching, the team intensified their efforts, not only to protect themselves but also to gather more evidence of the corruption that had put them in this position. They reached out to more whistleblowers, hacked files, and contacts within the industry. Anything they could use to ensure that they had the upper hand. But the tension in the air was palpable. The fear was real. They had taken on one of the most powerful industries in the world, and now they were being forced to fight for their very survival. As they prepared for the final showdown, one thing was clear. They had no choice but to go all in. The truth had become their weapon, and they would wield it with everything they had. The final confrontation was approaching, and there was no turning back. The days leading up to the final confrontation were fraught with fear and anticipation. Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia knew the stakes had never been higher. Their lives, the lives of their loved ones, and the future of their movement were all hanging in the balance. But more than that, the very idea of truth itself was at risk. If they backed down now, the entire system of manipulation they had been fighting would remain intact. In the quiet moments, when the world outside was buzzing with the noise of an ever-growing movement, they were reminded of why they had started this journey. It wasn't for fame, power, or accolades. It was for the people whose voices had been silenced by those who controlled the narrative. The victims of the pharmaceutical giants, the ones who had trusted the system, the ones who had suffered in the shadows. All of them were counting on the narrative project to win this battle. One evening, as the team gathered around their usual war room table, a sense of calm determination washed over them. They had made their plan, and now it was time to execute it. "We've got everything we need," Nadia said, her eyes scanning the documents laid out before them. The final report, the evidence, the whistleblower testimonies. "We're ready." Charlie looked at the team, his expression a mixture of resolve and anxiety. "This is it. This is the final push. We go public with everything, every last bit of evidence. And we make sure the whole world knows what's been happening." Keanu, ever the steady presence, nodded. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now. We do this right, and we change everything." The air was thick with tension, but there was also an undeniable sense of unity. They had become more than just colleagues. They had become a family, bound together by a singular mission. Each one of them knew the risks, but they also knew that what they were doing was bigger than any personal fear. The truth had to come out. The next day, they launched their final expose, a multi-part documentary that detailed every facet of the corruption they had uncovered. It was a culmination of months of work, of gathering evidence, interviewing insiders, and piecing together the puzzle of deceit. They didn't just reveal the pharmaceutical scandal, they exposed the entire system that allowed it to happen. The media manipulation, the political connections, the lies that had been woven into the fabric of society. The documentary went live with a press conference, where Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia appeared before an audience of reporters, activists, and international media outlets. As the camera lights flashed, Charlie took a deep breath, his voice unwavering as he spoke. "We stand here today not just as journalists or whistleblowers, but as citizens who believe in the power of truth. What we're about to show you is the result of years of deceit. It's time to bring those who have lied, manipulated, and harmed the public into the light." With a single motion, the team released the documentary. The screen behind them flickered to life, and the world watched as the damning evidence unfolded. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted in a frenzy. Hashtags like #exposethetruth and #pharmalies were trending worldwide. Millions of people shared the documentary, while news outlets scrambled to cover the story. The pharmaceutical companies that had once been untouchable were suddenly under intense scrutiny. Governments and regulatory bodies were forced to respond, their hands tied by the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. But the fight didn't end there. The corporations didn't just take the blow lying down. They fired back with everything they had: lawsuits, legal threats, and counterattacks meant to discredit the evidence and silence the voices of those involved. But this time, it was different. This time, the world was watching. The movement had gained too much momentum to be stopped by mere corporate pressure. In the days that followed, the team faced the most intense pushback yet. They were followed by private investigators, their phone lines tapped, and their personal lives once again targeted. But they were no longer afraid. They had come this far, and they had seen the power of truth to change the world. The pressure mounted as they were drawn into an intense legal battle. But Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia held their ground. Every court appearance, every interview, every statement they made was an opportunity to push the narrative forward, to ensure that the truth would not be buried again. And then, in a shocking turn of events, the very corporations that had once been untouchable began to crack. Whistleblowers inside the pharmaceutical giant stepped forward, corroborating the team's findings with even more damning evidence. Internal documents were leaked, proving that top executives had known about the dangerous side effects of their drugs and had deliberately covered them up. The public outcry was deafening. Protests erupted outside corporate offices and government buildings. People rallied in the streets, demanding accountability, justice, and reform. The movement that the Narrative Project had ignited was no longer just a fight for truth. It had become a revolution, one that threatened to topple the systems of power that had kept the public in the dark for so long. It was clear now that the truth could no longer be silenced. The narrative had shifted, and the forces of corruption had underestimated the power of the people. In the final hours of the battle, as the world seemed to hang on the precipice of change, Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia gathered one last time to reflect on everything they had been through. "We did it," Nadia said, her voice breaking as she looked at her colleagues. "We changed the world." Keanu looked out the window at the crowds gathering below, the roar of their voices filling the air. "We didn't just change the world. We gave people hope. Hope that the truth will always find a way to come out, no matter how powerful the forces against it are." Charlie nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We couldn't have done it without each other." This was never just about exposing one story. It was about showing the world that they have the power to demand the truth. And now they know. As the dust began to settle, and the long battle for justice came to a close, the team knew that their fight had only just begun. They had shattered the lies that had built the foundations of power, but there were still many more battles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia allowed themselves to believe in the possibility of a better world. A world where truth, transparency, and justice would always prevail. They had won the fight for the truth. And that was just the beginning. The story of the Narrative Project had become more than just an investigation. It had sparked a movement that changed the course of history. But as Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia reflected on their journey, they realized that the work was far from over. The battle for truth had been won, but the war for accountability was just beginning. In the years that followed, the impact of their work reverberated across the world. New laws were passed to regulate corporate influence in politics and media. Healthcare reforms were enacted, and new regulatory bodies were created to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable. More whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by the example the team had set, and a wave of transparency spread throughout industries that had long been shrouded in secrecy. However, not all was without consequence. The aftermath of their journey left scars, both physical and emotional. They had been tested in ways they hadn't imagined, and their personal lives had been altered forever. Yet, despite everything, they remained united in their mission. They knew the price they had paid, but they also understood the profound difference they had made. Years after the dust settled, Charlie stood before a large crowd at a global conference on transparency, truth, and accountability. The room was packed with activists, journalists, politicians, and concerned citizens from all corners of the world. His speech was a reflection on the journey that had started with a single decision to expose the truth, and how it had sparked a global wave of change. "I've often been asked if it was worth it," Charlie began, his voice steady. "If the sacrifices we made were worth the fight. And my answer is simple: yes. Every sleepless night, every threat, every moment of doubt, it was worth it. Because the truth is powerful. And when you stand together, when you believe in something bigger than yourself, you can change the world." Keanu, who had become a prominent advocate for freedom of the press and transparency, stood beside him on stage, nodding in agreement. His calm, determined demeanor had become a symbol of resilience, and his work had helped bridge the gap between journalism and activism in the fight for accountability. "Truth is not just a weapon. It's a right," Keanu added, his voice carrying the weight of his own journey. "And it's a right we must protect at all costs. We've seen the dangers of silence, of complacency. We've learned that power will always try to conceal itself. But when we stand together and demand transparency, we show that the people have the power to dismantle that which seeks to harm them." Nadia, ever the strategist, had become a leading figure in the world of media reform. Her efforts had led to the creation of independent watchdog organizations and public platforms where people could report and expose corruption without fear of retaliation. Her work had helped shift the power balance, ensuring that the truth always had a platform. "As journalists, as activists, as citizens, our duty is clear," Nadia said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We must hold those in power accountable, and we must ensure that those who seek the truth are never silenced again." This movement is about creating a world where the truth cannot be hidden, where every voice matters, and where justice is always served. The success of the Narrative Project had ignited a global transformation. People in positions of power began to realize that their actions would no longer go unnoticed. Political leaders, once insulated by wealth and influence, were forced to answer for their actions. Corporations, no longer shielded by their money and connections, faced public scrutiny and the threat of legal action. But perhaps the most profound change was in the hearts of ordinary people. Empowered by the knowledge that they could make a difference, everyday citizens began to speak out against injustice. Whistleblowers, activists, and journalists were no longer isolated. There was strength in numbers. People realized that they didn't have to remain silent in the face of corruption. They could fight back. And in the years to come, the movement that Charlie, Keanu, and Nadia had started would continue to grow. New leaders would emerge, new stories would be told, and new battles would be fought. The fight for truth and accountability was a never-ending one. But with each victory, the world grew a little brighter, a little freer. As time passed, Charlie found himself back at his desk, typing the final words of his memoir. It had been a long road, and though the world had changed in ways he had never imagined, he couldn't help but reflect on the cost of their journey. The scars were there, visible and invisible, but so were the victories. He paused, looking at the page before him. There was so much more to say, but in this moment, he knew that the words that mattered the most had already been written by the lives they had touched, the changes they had made, and the truth they had revealed. And just as he was about to finish the final sentence, there was a knock at the door. It was Keanu, a familiar smile on his face. "You done yet?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Charlie chuckled. "I think so." Keanu stepped inside and sat across from him, his usual calm demeanor reflecting the peace that had settled over him in the years since the battle had ended. "You know, we've made a lot of noise over the years, changed a lot of lives. But the real impact, it's not in the headlines or the lawsuits. It's in the small victories. In the people who now believe they can stand up. That's where the real change happens." Charlie nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You're right. It's the small victories that matter most." Nadia walked in next, her eyes alight with the energy that had fueled their fight. "So, what's next?" she asked, her voice full of that familiar determination. Charlie smiled, setting down his pen. "The fight never stops. But for now, we celebrate what we've accomplished and look ahead to the work still to be done." Together, they stood, united as they had been from the start. The world was a different place now, but one thing was clear. The truth, once exposed, could never be contained again. And as long as there were voices to tell it, the fight for accountability, transparency, and justice would never end.